Present.
Mr. Lewis. Mr. Roberts.
Here.
Mr. Smythe.
Here.
Ms. Stevenson.
Present.
Mayor Pressing.
Here.
I think we have a quorum. I want to remind any of you who are out there, if you do want to speak, be sure to complete a yellow slip. There's a couple of you that have already done so, and I'll call on you at the time that you've requested. And that when you do come up front to speak, please be reminded to speak no more than 5 minutes. If you could limit your remarks to that time frame, we would greatly appreciate it. If there are others of you who do want to speak at any time, you can complete one of these yellow slips and bring it up to our clerk. Are there any additions to the agenda that you have before you tonight? Okay, seeing no additions, we'll stick with the agenda as it's stated in front of us. Are there staff reports?
I have none at this time.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. The next item of business is the approval of our minutes, and they were mailed out in our packet as well as, I think, just mailed out in our packet. And if there are any changes to these minutes, I'd like to hear them at this time.
I would move that they would be approved.
I'll second that.
Okay, it's been moved by Dennis Roberts and seconded by Heather Stevenson to approve the minutes. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
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 Any nay? Minutes stand approved. Thank you. We're now at the time in our meeting where we have an opportunity to have public input, and I have one individual who would like to speak before the agenda items are presented, so this would be the time, and it is Paul DeBevic. If you would please come forward and state your name, your address, and speak clearly into the mic. And I do want to remind you, all of us, that we want to lean forward and speak into the mics, and then if any of you can't hear things that we say, don't hesitate to say, I can't hear, okay? Thank you. Mr. DeBevic.
My name is Paul DeBevic. I reside at 708 West California. What brings me here, I just have a couple of comments to make concerning the IDOT traffic stop statistics. And I read the article that is in our local News Gazette on Saturday, and I think what brought me here was to try to be supportive of Chief Adair. My interactions and our neighborhood association's interactions with him have shown that as an individual he has the highest interest of our community and his police department at hand, and I believe that he would give a accurate assessment of this report. The report, in fact, is 175 pages. The data for the report is some 2,000 pages. I did read the executive summary and glanced through the report itself. And in my professional life, I do experiments, and I do them with accuracy. And we distinguish in our experiments between numbers are precise. For example, 28.24% of the driving population is a precise number, but is it accurate? Accuracy, in fact, is difficult to achieve, and in this report, the methodology causes me some concern that it will be very easy to look at a single number and come to any sort of conclusion whatsoever. And when the conclusion that one approaches has in any form the word race, racial, racist, we must step very, very carefully because these, in fact, are rather incendiary words. And in this methodology, basically, the people, in fact, look at the number of traffic stops. And they have an estimate of the driving population, of the racial character of it. So the first point I make is that they say it's an estimate of the driving population. And indeed, nowhere in the report do they tell me how accurate is the estimate. The estimate isn't terribly precise, but is it accurate? And for that matter, the entire state of Illinois in their study has this ratio to be 1.15. So that means roughly 15% of the time black people are stopped by the police more than is in their population. But in a given community, the estimate of the driving population, in fact, may be quite inaccurate and indeed that's stated on page 5 of the executive summary. The other point that bothers me about this report is that, again, from page 5 of the executive summary, it assumes that officers actually know the race of the driver prior to making a stop. In many cases, officers probably cannot make such a determination. So in a ratio of two numbers, the top of which is the race of the person making that has been stopped, and the study, in fact, does not even claim that the police know the race of who's making the stop. And I thought to myself, all right, suppose I were to work on this experiment, what would I do? Well, I would say it's likely that a policeman would not know the race of a driver if it were at dark, because you can't see who's in the car. And is there such a check upon the methodology in the study? And the answer is no. Now, for sure, the number of people who are stopped, the racial profile of the people that are stopped is inarguable. Those, I think, are in fact completely accurate number. But the motivations for these stops is highly questionable. And I'll repeat the sentence. It assumes that officers actually know the race of the driver prior to making a stop. And that seems to be an assumption that is, well, without any checks within the report. And I mean, I've never done social science research, but it would seem to me some way of trying to verify that assumption would be absolutely mandatory. In fact, Chief Adair, in his News Gazette, comes to some suggestions of how to explain the particular numbers in Urbana. And you know, his numbers suggest, well, we do a lot of our traffic stops in poorer communities. And I think it's a factual matter of the racial character of the poorer communities. So in summary, we have a report before us. It has some numbers, but we measure what we measure. The question is, what did we measure? Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Dubevik. We have another speaker at this time, Mr. John L. Johnson. Would you please step up to the microphone and state your name and your address for the council, please?
Mayor Council, John L. Johnson, 4040 Spain, Champaign. I have some brief comments, but before I do that, because I've had the pleasure of addressing the Champaign City Council over the same subject. And what concerned me is the appearance of detachment between the council who's receiving the report and the police department. And I would like to submit to you that the police is an extension of this government. It's an extension of you, because you are the elected council, not the police. You are. So the report is provided to you for you to measure the fairness of the operation of your police department as it relates to the conduct and treatment of minority people. And that's important. It's not a report for you to distance yourself from. It's a report for you to embrace and to attempt to understand, particularly in those areas where you cannot understand the report. So I wanted to say that because we have a tendency, I think, in order to defend ourselves, to distance ourselves from criticism and not understand that you are the elected officials. As Harry Truman says, the buck stops with you, not with me, but with you. And you chose to put yourself in that position because you sought the office, and the people of your districts and of this community elected you. So you are the appropriate body to receive the complaint. You are the appropriate body to try to understand and measure the complaint as regards to its fairness. So my comments are that the Urbana Police Department failed to explain why its stop ratios of black motorists is higher than our estimate of minority driving public of 30.62. Now what's important about this is that the Urbana Police Department's benchmark really doesn't make any sense. You don't know who it is. It says minorities. Well, what minorities? As you know, the original question of policing dealt with African American minorities. The legislature, in adopting the bill, gave specific categories in which the police department was to identify: white, African American, Asian Pacific Islanders, and Hispanics. So those have to be identified to say what is the benchmark that your police department is attempting to measure in order for you to understand whether or not if the stop ratios are fair. We do not know what it is that the local benchmark minority drivers as classified by the state or by our local benchmark. Nor are we told why the minority motorists were stopped in the location of the stop to measure the ratio of those stops to our overall local benchmark. It's important, as I understand the legislation, for your police department to tell you not only who was stopped, but the location and the gender of who was stopped, as well as the reasons for which the officer made the stop. There are a list of reasons that I believe the chief gave in his report, but there's no map overlaying it. We do not know if these stops were made in heavily populated areas in which minority motorists frequent. We don't know if the stops were made in areas where not heavily populated, where minorities frequent, or whatever. The chief makes a correlation between stops for services and increase in stops. Well, fine, but that's not, and I'm not a mathematician, so, and I know my math teachers, wherever they are, and I believe they're all in heaven, would be applauding on that statement when they think of my test scores. I'm not a mathematician, but I would say that in those statements, there are no benchmarks to measure those statements. They're just things that chiefs threw out there. We get complaints, and these complaints have certain percentage categories over the what, to what, to what, to what. I believe that the Northwestern report clearly tells us in their writings how to go about declaring benchmarks. Well, I know this is the first exercise for the Atlanta Police Department, but it says that this exercise has to be met, and I believe this is one of your charge, and that is tell us what your benchmark is. Tell us who you're attempting to identify and how we are to judge whether or not it is fair, and this report doesn't do that. And I think it has to do that. We need to know where. If the chief is saying, gee, we are increasing our stops in Zone 2 because of increased illegal activities, whatever those activities ought to be, we ought to look at a geographic map of Zone 2. We ought to be able to measure those stops. And then we ought to look at the cost for services to see whether or not, if the goal of the police department, which were to drive down those costs, if that indeed happened. And then to give an overall measurement of the area to see if that's balanced. I said to the Champaign City Council, and I'll say to you, that I believe it was Justice O'Connor who said that 9/11 did not give President Bush a blank check to toy with the civil rights of the American people. So police departments don't have it, you don't have it, I don't have it, none of us have it. And so blanket statements, even though these blanket statements may sound good, from the standpoint of police administration, your obligation under the state statutes requires you, I believe, to look a little deeper and to have more clarification as to what the police department is doing and how it applies. Nor are we told the ratio of stops to all calls for services in the community based on the benchmark of that community. Your obligation under the state statutes requires you, I believe, to look a little deeper and to have more clarification as to what the police department is doing and how it applies. Nor are we told the ratio of stops to all calls for services in the community based on the benchmark of that community. And are we using the benchmark of Champaign and Urbana? I know there are black drivers and non-black drivers who cross the line. How many of these drivers from Champaign impact upon black drivers in predominantly black motorist areas? How many did not? How many of them are students from the university? What is the impact of all of this? What are we determining as the benchmark from the area that we want to look at? I think we all know, particularly around our public housing complexes, that there is some cross relationship between citizens from all of our communities, and I think we all know that citizens from the university as well as Champaign visit our communities, and what is the impact of all of that. We cannot distinguish between the ratio of stops between whites and blacks until we examine, in my opinion, the areas of the stops, the benchmark, and the reason for the stops, along with the gender of the people who were stops. Now we get from the department, some statements, but those statements cannot be connected to a real analysis of the fairness of it. And finally, the goal of this exercise is to help our community to measure the results of our police stop policies as best that we can, and to eliminate all bias and illegal activities or conduct that our police officers may be involved in. And I have just one simple final statement that came to my mind as I was jotting down these notes. Where is it? Here it is. This is not the end, but only the beginning of the Urbana Police Department must provide this council and the general public honest benchmarking, which enables us to judge their action and their reports. And if they fail to do this, I think that this will eschew your policies and eschew the ability of our community to work with our police department to weed out any dishonesty and any improper use of the laws. It is the 14th Amendment in which you are trying to protect here. It was the 14th Amendment in which the legislature enacting this law, in which the governor signed, is trying to protect. That amendment is greater than any individual in our police department, and greater than our police department collectively, and greater than all of us collectively. So it is a high esteem in which this obligation is upon you, in which this report should be examined. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. There are questions? Danielle?
Yes, ma'am.
A couple of questions. John, when you refer to collecting information about the reasons for the stop, are you referring to something beyond equipment versus moving violations? Those were the way in which the...
That's how it's categorized in the report.
Would you suggest finer grain, or
Well-
what's your suggestion vis-a-vis that?
But I don't know, because I haven't seen a police report, as to how an officer records the reasons for stop. And it could be just a general category in which the department is presented to you. The idea is to try to understand the thinking. That's the intent of the legislature. What was the thinking of the officer when he made the stop? And can you measure that thinking to overlap possible prejudice? If you simply say, I measured it, I stopped him for a license plate violation, was that true or was it not true? I don't know. I know I've been in cars, and we were stopped and told our lights were out over the license plates, and they were not out. So what was the intent of the officer? So you don't know. Some of these things we'll never know. We'll never know unless there are citations filed and other actions taken by the officer. But I think that not knowing it is less important than the questions you ask and the procedures enacted by the department and by the council and the demands by the public of fair play. When the police department, like anyone, is aware that there's concern for fair play, it will not eliminate all the problems, because the police they put on their pants the same way I do, one leg at a time. So there's always going to be a certain element of bias and a certain element of problems, because they represent the general public also. But just as in anything, we can reduce as much possible by shedding light on things. Not all of it, but by shedding light.
I have a quick follow-up question, which is, when you refer to setting benchmarks, the benchmark in this report is the number of residents who are African American who drive, in the case of looking at the African American population. And there are statistical problems with that, looking at residents versus number of people. But when you're talking about benchmarks, you had mentioned a couple of things like breaking up the city into zones, looking at calls for service per location, also looking at stops in those locations. I guess I'm trying to get a better picture of what it is that you're talking about when you refer to benchmarks.
Well, what I'm talking about is exactly what are we talking about. I mean, there are Hispanics, and the legislature says you don't have to define each Hispanic group. Hispanics can be defined in a combined population. But if we're saying minority people, what minorities? I mean, we are all brothers and sisters under God, but we are not categorized by our government as such. So we need to know that, and the driving population is anybody over 15. So, I mean, how is the Urbana Police Department defining that population, and how are they defining minorities? And it's up to the council, along with the input of the public, to help to define that. Are we going to take the U.S. Census data to define it for us? Are we going to use the state of Illinois statistics on driving population to define it? The university doesn't say to any community, you must define what your own benchmark is. It's up to you, working with your local government, to define its benchmarks. And the police department can help you do that. You can do that yourself. But we need to have a basis to determine the excessiveness and non-excessiveness of stops. And Urbana has to sit its own, not Champagne's. But Urbana has to sit its own, not Rantoul, they'll sit their own to determine whether or not if the Urbana Police Department is acting fairly.
Are there further questions?
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Mr. Burnell Dixon, would you please come up and state your name and address for the council?
Good evening. My name is Burnell Dixon. I live at 507 Crystal Lake in Urbana, and I'm here to address the council on the profiling issue. I came in on the tail end of the gentleman before, John Lee Johnson, and frankly, I was a little surprised at some of his statements. He had indicated that police usually don't know who you are before they stop you, but sometimes police do stake you out. Sometimes police follow you for a couple blocks before they stop you. So it's disingenuous to think that they don't know who they stop, especially in the daytime. They follow you for a few blocks, check your plates, and the majority of the time they know exactly who you are, what color you are. Profiling has been going on for more than 20 years. Why there hasn't been one police officer, one state's attorney, one judge who asked why are we stopping so many black individuals, I do not know. But we need to stop this. This is a progressive and righteous city council, and you have control of the police department. You can do this. I'm a little disappointed that we have been the victims, or people of color have been the victims of inordinate stops. I don't want people to spit on me and tell me it's raining. I want us to do better. I want us to do something. Okay? And you guys have control over the police department. I believe the chief and the police department report to you. Let's not pass this off as simply saying we're going to do better. Let's do something. I was at the Champaign City Council on the profiling issue, and I listened to their police department say that we don't know why we're doing this and we're going to investigate it. But we know. Let's not fool ourselves. Now, I voted for 2 of you on this council. I'm proud of you. And I'd like to ask you as a citizen to make this police department representative of the community and make it fair and equitable. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I don't believe there's any other further public input that wanted to be heard before, so I think we're ready to go on with the rest of our business. And our first item of business is ordinance number 2005-07-115, an ordinance approving and authorizing the execution of a development incentive agreement with CTC Properties, LLC, and has to do with Kmart site reuse. Now, we do have an individual who would like to speak at this time, though, on this particular subject, Mr. James Beauchamp. If you would please come forward and state your name and your address for the council. Thank you.
I'm James Beauchamp, and I live at 1002 Elliott in Urbana, and I live near Philo Road. And I've been very disturbed over the past year or so about the empty storefronts that we've had along Philo and the degeneration of the possibilities for shopping in southeast Urbana, in Urbana in general. And so I was excited to see the announcement about the new apartments and shops that would be that were proposed to go in to the Kmart site. So I just want to urge the council to approve this proposal. And I think it's a great idea and a great start. We really need to develop Philo Road, and this is a good beginning. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'll turn it over to Mr. Walden.
Good evening. Very pleased tonight to review with you the substance of the agreement between the City of Urbana and CTC Properties, which is a limited liability corporation. Chris Creek is here representing that corporation tonight. What we have tonight is a draft agreement. The draft agreement provides for the redevelopment of the Kmart site, the demolition of the existing building, and the redevelopment of the site with approximately 40,000 square foot of retail and approximately 300 units of high-end apartments. The timing of this redevelopment is covered in the agreement, but it's a relatively fast-track proposal with demolition of the structure beginning in the next 45 days or so, and then the redevelopment occurring over a 2-year period. Where we are today is that the developers have a contract to purchase the property, and it's contingent upon 2 or 3 items. The primary item is a satisfactory agreement to the developer, a redevelopment agreement between the city and the developer. So that's the primary issue that's outstanding. There are a couple others outstanding that are the typical due diligence in a real estate acquisition such as this, including environmental review and whatnot. But the primary issue is can a satisfactory agreement be reached between the city and the developer. As you know, we have been concentrating on Philo Road and the redevelopment of Philo Road for several months now, and working closely with the mayor and the new council in trying to come up with a plan that's appropriate to that area. The background for that is very well put forth in the report on Philo Road and the plan that was adopted actually by the previous council, but to be implemented by this council. And it puts forward some of the notions that we have regarding the redevelopment of Philo Road, including trying to address some of the aesthetic issues, some of the blight issues that we have with the existence of these large big box stores that will likely never be big box stores again. The issues relating to pushing retail out towards Philo Road, the notion of population and how adding population to the area would help support the base of neighborhood retail. And so for many reasons, this development suits our plan. We have tried to give you tonight an agreement that sets forth most of the terms. I would point out to you that there are several missing pieces to this that we hope to put together over the next 2 weeks or so, not the least of which is a more formal site plan. There are 2 or 3 drafts of site plans floating around right now. Developers working closely on that. And we have additional elevations, so the developer will have additional elevations of the proposed project that he will provide to us prior to a final action. The obligations of the agreement with respect to the city fall primarily into 2 areas. One is that is in the area of financial assistance, and one of the things that we are agreeing to do for this development is to reimburse the costs of demolition to the developer. City staff has obtained its own estimates for the demolition, and those numbers are represented in this agreement. The second item that let me address that point. This is something that we have done in several projects that are redevelopment projects. For example, the site that did house the Europe Inn was an agreement between the city and the developer to tear that down for the purposes of redevelopment. Likewise, the former Yin Ching site was a separate agreement that the city paid for and reimbursed the cost of demolition to induce redevelopment there. The Strong Banquet Center site, which we'll address later, is another one where we have provided the costs for demolition in order to induce redevelopment. And if one thinks about that, it makes some sense, and from a public policy point of view, we know in terms of the redevelopment of downtown and some of our older areas that it costs more to redevelop these areas. Even though the infrastructure exists in many cases, it costs more from a financial point of view to redevelop these sites than it does to go out in greenfield type development. So in order to help address that, we've pursued this policy, and this action is consistent with that policy. The second major obligation that we are making in this agreement is not directly related to the site nor directly related to the finances of the site. It is related to the extension or connection of Florida Avenue between its terminus now existing near Savannah Green and Route 130. And we have done some preliminary design on that piece of road work. It's contained within your capital improvement plan. We moved it up in this last budget cycle as a top priority for the city, although our timing was uncertain in the last CIP that you approved. What we're doing here and what we're committing to, and I want to make sure we all understand, is that we're committing to a timetable that we will go forward with this within 2 years. And if necessary, we'll take whatever actions we have to assure that this important transportation connection is provided to the citizens and to support these types of developments. So that's a pretty significant commitment. The amounts of money that we have proposed for this project do not change. They're the same as contained within the CIP. And my recollection is, in Bill's here, I think that was about $1.2 million project. City was about half of that, I think, including signal on Route 130. So maybe we should back that out. But that's the scope of the project. What we anticipate is that, quite frankly, I believe that we'll reach some sort of voluntary agreement with the surrounding property owners in the near term, and I believe that we'll come up with a satisfactory method to put that improvement through. The obligations of the developer are simple. They are to move forward quickly, to demolish the building in a timely fashion, as specified in the agreement, to invest a minimum of $20 million in the project, and to construct the project in a manner that's consistent with the elevations and site plan that we will later receive. It's important that we provide at this time, because of the contingencies in the project, an indication to the developer of our willingness to go forward, even though we have not worked out all of the details. And certainly we can discuss the details as they become available. But it was important, given the time frame of this project, to get an early indication we're going to do this, and is this something that we want to pursue. I don't believe I have any other important points. The zoning is appropriate for the use. I pointed out to in the memo that just on a preliminary basis, it looks like all Urbana taxing districts would receive about $400,000 a year from the development just out of the gate. So in terms of return on investment, it's a fairly short turnaround for us. There are many other benefits that would accrue both to the population generally, but particularly to the Sunnycrest area from the redevelopment of that area. We believe, it's been our experience, that these types of key projects, when located, have a tendency to bring additional projects, and once we turn the corner, we will begin to see other projects take place in that area. We do know that there are other projects in the wings in that area. We know that there are some outlots at the Jewel site that are being marketed by Paul Tapman. We know there's a gas station being redeveloped across the corner. We know that there are some plans from Mr. Neiman to redevelop or to improve the grocery store. So, we're very optimistic that in the next couple of years that we will turn this area around with your support and your guidance.
Thank you, Bruce. As part of the discussion, what you're recommending then is that we send, if we agree, that we send it forward to council for approval subject to completion of the exhibits, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Discussion. Heather.
I just want to applaud and thank Chris Creek for the hard work that he's done on this project, and I think it is going to be great for the city, and I just, again, thank you for your hard work in this.
Danielle?
Yeah, this is a great project. It's very exciting. I had a couple of questions. One is just in terms of logistics and protecting the city through this process, which we always have to look out for in our development agreements. When does the developer get paid the reimbursement on the demolition, and what's the scenario if, for example, the demolition happens and then for some reason the developer goes bankrupt and isn't able to complete the project?
What we would do, as we have done in these previous instances where we've used demolition as an incentive for redevelopment, we would make a payment on a reimbursement basis on the completion and verification by my office that the demolition is complete. At that time, we would record a mortgage and note against the property in the amount securing the city, whatever position that we are. Sometimes it depends on, it would be subordinate to a construction loan, for example. At the point that there was substantial progress with the project, as, for example, the Walgreens project, we had substantial completion, including roof and walls of the new facility, then we would release the security to the city. And the development agreement anticipates doing the very same thing here.
Great. Follow-up question. What's the development agreement says that the retail space will be approximately 40,000 square feet. Is there a threshold in terms of minimum square footage that our staff would find acceptable if that number shrinks and shrinks? At what point do we say, look, we want a retail component in this. We want to make sure it's not just a residential situation. Does this development agreement protect us with that approximate language?
Well, for me, plus or minus a couple thousand square feet is
Yeah.
approximate.
Okay.
And I don't know if you want to write in any additional assurances on that, but that's what it means to me. Certainly, it would be a substantial change in the agreement to reduce the retail square footage.
Okay. And then my last question is the situation with the enterprise zone. I was trying to refresh my memory in terms of what our sales tax situation will be once the retail space is occupied.
Right.
What does sales tax look like for us after the retail space is occupied?
I did not make that projection.
Okay. So it was just property tax. The 400,000 is just property tax.
To all Urbana taxes.
To all Urbana taxing
Right,
bodies,
right.
but it did not include
Right.
sales tax. Okay.
I did not make that projection because I don't know how many are service or how many, I could make a wild guess on that based upon square footages of other retail, other developments, but I did not do that. What was the first part of the
So
question?
the enterprise zone, just
Oh,
remind me.
the enterprise
what-
zone,
yeah.
yes, I'm glad you brought that
Do
up.
we lose sales tax because of
We-
the enterprise zone, et cetera?
Right.
How long does that last, et cetera?
We made a request for an extension to the enterprise zone program for the Sunnycrest area. That was approved at staff, and we're waiting for the final ordinance from the state, the final document from the state that approved that extension. I don't expect any problem. I expect that to happen shortly. And what that does is it enables this project, as well as all of them in the Philo Road project, to be eligible for enterprise zone incentives. The enterprise zone incentives that are offered via our program are really twofold. One is that any materials purchased for this project anywhere in Illinois would be tax exempt for the materials that went into the project. And two, it provides for the abatement of county and city property taxes for 5 years only, not the entire property tax, just the city and county share. That's the standardized program in our enterprise zone. It's automatic. We don't have to act upon it. It happens automatically. So that's what happens there. So the purchase of materials are tax exempt and purchased anywhere in the state of Illinois. And then there's about 15% of property tax abatement for a 5-year period.
So the 15% of the 400,000 would not be collected for the first 5 years?
That's correct. To the city
To the
and the
city and the
county.
county.
The park district, of course, the school district would be about 200,000 of that, and they would not be affected.
Okay. And does the enterprise zone allow for apartments and residential uses to be included in that, so that residential, property tax on residential properties would be included in the enterprise zone?
Yeah, we do not have, there's a difference between single-family, of course, and these multi-use facilities. The multi-use facilities, to the best of our knowledge, are included. If you just did a separate, like Prairie Winds, for example, that would not be included in our enterprise zone program.
Okay,
Straight-up
but
residential.
these
multi-use
multi-use-
facilities, whether downtown or otherwise, are included.
Okay. That's what it makes
Makes sense.
a lot of financial sense then in that situation. Thanks.
So, I didn't, the turnaround time for our investment is short. It's less than a year. If you include sales tax, I don't know when that will kick in, a couple of years down the road, so it's highly recommended from a financial point of view.
Okay, thank you.
Charlie?
Yeah, I think we all welcome this development, particularly as it might apply to young professionals who probably we don't have enough housing for them. That's been a concern, condos and that sort of thing. I have two sort of long-term questions on this. You talk about development loan through the text of the agreement. What exactly do you mean, and what are we committing ourselves to in that respect?
The only thing that we're committing ourselves to is the repayment for the demolition. And once that occurs, the only loan document is to recover that. It's not to provide additional money, it's simply to recover that. So it's the same as you would have as a note and mortgage on your home. So a note and mortgage would be recorded on the property subject to first mortgage or a construction loan, and that would be our security on the project. If for some reason the project did not finish by the terms of the agreement, we would have that security, so if the property were sold, we'd be able to recover our expenditure. But there are no other loans associated. It's only to recover if necessary, which I don't think will be the demolition amount.
Okay, I've reread the section on the extension of Florida Avenue several times now, and it's starting to sink in what exactly it means. So basically, at the end of 2 years, if it's not done, all that we're really committed to doing is making sure we're trying to get it done. Is that the way to read it?
What it says is at the end of the 2 years that we'll do what's necessary to assure that it's completion. If that means going to court for a special assessment or to acquire the right-of-way, that's what we'll do.
Okay. But conceivably, it's more likely that this project will get off the ground next year. And this might be a question for Mr. Gray. From the optimistic way you've spoken about it, I get the impression that we're going to see this or maybe happen next year.
Well, the important point, hopefully, that we can reach an agreement with the surrounding property owners in the next year. That's my goal, if not sooner. There are things happening along that corridor in terms of sale of property, and it's my hope that, as I originally planned, as Bill and I have worked on this, that we'll be able to reach an agreement with surrounding property owners that allocates costs and moves this project forward. Certainly the greatest beneficiary of the extension of this road would be the surrounding property owners. So obviously we want, and there's a benefit to them, and they should help pay for part of it. So what we hope to do is, as soon as possible and within the next year if possible as well, is to reach some sort of agreement with these new property owners on the construction of Florida Avenue, including the allocation of costs, and that's our goal. If within a 2-year period we do not do that, we'll have to do what's necessary to put this public improvement in.
Okay, so let's just say, for example, we do have this all done. We get all the ducks lined up in the next year. How long will it take to build this, and what do you ballpark as the estimate of what it's going to cost us as a city? And following up on that is, how does this affect other items in the capital improvement plan?
I'll let Bill address that if you want. The cost in the CIP, the preliminary cost in the CIP, exclusive of right-of-way, but including work on 130, was $1,250,000, I believe. The cost allocation to the city, my recollection is, and Bill can correct me, is about half of that, given the geometric improvements at the intersection, the signal, and then 1/3 of the cost of the road. There's no money in there for right-of-way acquisition. We hope to get that as a part of the subdivision process for that property. The timing would be based on whether we did this internally or hired it out. At this point, it would be my guess that Bill will probably recommend that we use a consultant to finish the design, but I don't know that. I'll have to ask him.
The construction itself would probably be a good part of a year, so 4 months plus or minus, depending on contractor and that sort of thing. As far as who would do the design, that's up for discussion. Ideally would be a consultant that would do that design. It's not programmed at this time in our work the next 12, 18 months. Does that answer your questions basically, or?
Yeah, so basically we could conceivably, if everything works out right, we could conceivably get it done in 2 years.
Yes.
Have it up and running.
Mm-hmm.
I guess my only follow-up concern is the costs. Where is the money for our share of that going to come from? And what will its impact be on other items in the capital improvement plan? You know, because basically we're going to bump this up and make it a high priority item. I forget when it's scheduled for.
Well, the capital improvement plan, we had it scheduled for construction in 2007. So that construction season is what we had in the CIP, but that was barring any further information. So the money is, where it's coming from, it's just the capital replacement improvement fund is where the money's programmed from, our share.
Okay, so conceivably it could be bumped up a year if we started next year under construction.
Yes, but we need to look and see something else may have to exchange for that project.
Dennis?
I think that the plan, the development sounds really positive and good, and conceivably very doable. The most confusing part, I think, to really or the least, the part that's least able to be pegged down is the extension of Florida Road.
Mm-hmm.
Now I can imagine that we just recently did apply for a bike path grant, and that bike path grant goes up 130, and there might be some cost benefit for the development of that particular connection to 130, the intersection itself, perhaps, because there'll be money to develop the bike path route that might be minimal plus on on the side of that connection. But where we haven't, I imagine, begun at all any discussion about the road extension project possibility with landowners at this time, right?
Well, actually, we have had discussion with at least one of the landowners and have an agreement out of one of the landowners that they will participate in their pro rata share.
Is that on the south side of the property?
Yeah, but the remaining parcels that abut the right-of-way or the road are in transition, let's say. That, it's likely that ownership will change on those. And so, in the very near term. And so, one of our top priorities will be to work out with these new property owners the construction of this facility, this road. So, whoever they may be.
Whoever they may be.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like the most difficult part of the agreement to work with, because there's so many unknown factors involved in it.
Well, if we can get an agreement with the property owners in the next year or so, it's very simple. I can turn this over to Bill, and he can get it done because we already programmed it in the CIP, and he can get the designs done. The key is to try to get it done on a voluntary basis with the property owners, and I know that kind of falls to me, and I'll try to do that. In the event that that doesn't happen, then we need to do something else to put this road through. So, and
we would have the right to take such steps, actually.
Yes, correct.
Through eminent domain or some other.
That's correct.
Yes.
Special assessment, whatever.
Okay.
Are we ready for a motion? Heather?
I just want to applaud Bill Gray and for the work that you've done, and to make sure that this the steps that you've covered with the extension of Florida Avenue, and you too, Bruce. And I move that we send this to council for approval.
And it's been moved by Heather Stevenson and seconded by Charlie Smythe. Is there further discussion? Danielle?
Yeah, I have a question for the developer, actually. In terms of looking at the square footage retail space, I guess I want to see if it would be acceptable to write into the development agreement that it would be no less than 35,000 square feet of retail space, or does that does that tie your hands in this situation? Or is it your understanding that approximately 40,000 square feet of retail space would be at least 35,000?
Could you approach the microphone, please? Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
We're currently planning on 40,000 square feet. As it develops, that could change plus or minus. We're currently sending out packages to a whole bunch of different entities and looking to see what they need. We have some people that we thought would take 4,000 square feet. They're not committed, but if they do, they need 6. So I would say that we'll be close. We're going to make every attempt to make 40,000 square feet.
Would you be amenable to us writing a minimum of 35,000 square feet into the development agreement?
The problem that I'd have with that is that if, one, we could get 35,000 square feet of retail. We could get 40,000 square feet of retail. We're very conscious of the quality of the retail, and I'd hate to be put in that situation. I wouldn't want to be put in that situation. The retail we put in is going to be very high quality retail.
Is there a minimum that you would think that there would be a square foot minimum in terms of retail space? And just so you understand, we're looking at 5 years of tax abatement, property tax abatement,
Sure.
which if we're looking at a purely residential development, in some ways, although it's infill development, and that's certainly very important, that's a significant tax abatement for something that we're not having a difficulty generating in our community. We have demand for multifamily dwellings. The issue is that we need goods and services on Philo Road. We need people to have access to things that they need. We also need the sales tax base as well. So I'm concerned that in putting approximately in and then seeing this whittled down and when it's built, see 15,000 square feet, 20,000 square feet of retail space, which I don't think it was the intention of this development agreement. So I'm a little uncomfortable moving forward with that approximately. At the same time, I understand that you're responding to industry trends. I know that you don't necessarily have the same kind of direct access to the interstate as, say, you would on High Cross Road. So I understand these issues, and I guess I'd like to firm up some kind of minimum number so that when we see this come out of the ground in the next 2 years, we have some assurances for the public in terms of the trade-off between the tax abatement and what they get in terms of retail square footage. So I guess I kind of throw the ball in your court. What do you think is reasonable as a minimum so that we can ensure to our constituents that we're going to have some retail space in this piece of property, this development?
You know, that was just thrown at me, and I'd hate to answer that and be wrong. But let me tell you that we have approached 3 national companies, and the very first question out of their mouth is, send me the traffic counts. We don't have very good traffic counts to send them right now. We have gone as far right now of offering some national high-quality companies free use of the property for 12 or 24 months. I have as much interest in retail as anybody. I own Amber Point Apartments. Our people that live out there would love to ride a bicycle or to take a long walk to dinner or a coffee shop or something like that. We don't have that ability. So I'd hate to commit to it, but I can tell you that I would hate to be forced to lease property. Right now, I think that we have about 16,000 square feet that I feel pretty good about. Some of those we had to give concessions with if they decide to take our offer. So if I were to commit to something, I don't know that I would want to make it more than 30,000 feet. I've told Bruce that I would. 40,000 feet is what I think we can hit. That's why the extension is so important to us.
Yes.
11,000, the traffic count of 11,000 is not a lot. And we're trying to put that to all of our prospective tenants that the traffic count will go up, and I believe that it will. But they don't put a lot of faith in always in what I believe, right?
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Well, we are going to have 700 700 new residents out there. I probably have 600 at Amber Point. We've got a new development called Water's Edge, which will bring about another 400 or 500 people. That's out in Stone Creek. So those counts are going to enhance our ability to get these companies. Actually, Vance Bar had a company come and wanted 9,000 square feet. So you don't know. You just don't know.
Well, we definitely are interested in working with you to increase traffic counts on Philo Road and to extend Florida Avenue. So I think that's a commitment from this council to work with you on that. I guess just to speak to the motion, I'm going to support the motion. It's a very exciting project. I look forward to looking at site plans, et cetera. I do, a note to our CIO, I'd like to maybe have further conversation, Bruce, about making sure that we have some sense of a guarantee of a retail space. I don't want to kind of work it out on the committee floor right now, but if we could see something for next week that is a more solid guarantee, you all can have a conversation, that would be great.
Okay, there's a motion on the table, and there's a second. There's a further discussion. Dennis?
I was just thinking that it would be a stronger presentation and somewhat more reassuring if the 4 or 5 blank exhibit pages that were attached to the report did have indeed some kind of plan sketch, so that we could have a sense of what ratio of retail building versus like the parking construction of the site. I know that right now there's more parking than can be imagined because the entire front of the Kmart store is a parking lot. But it's always been kind of a concern to have an appropriate balance between the building space and the parking, have adequate parking. And I'm curious to know whether some of your retail space will be 2-story, or are you envisioning all 1-story buildings?
All of our retail space will be on the first floor. Very little of our parking. Some of the retail will require visible parking. They'll want visible parking. But we found a place in Winter Park, Florida, where their parking is all underneath, and it appears to be a finished building on the outside. We're going to incorporate that. If you look at the building, the first floor might resemble mostly retail, because that's what it will be. But the parts of it that are parking will also appear to be of residential. It will have the windows. But once you get inside the main entrance, it'll be a large parking lot. It was a great idea and worked real well down there. I think it will work well here.
And is that especially or more specifically for the residential section of it, or is that as well your plan for constructing the parking for the retail section as well?
The major retail, which will be on Philo Road, will probably have outside parking.
On street parking, yeah.
They really have to have that, as they're telling us. So as you came into the Kmart old entrance, the main entrance on Philo Road, that would still probably be parking for our sports bar and our copy center and our restaurant. We need another restaurant down in that area pretty badly, and we've come close. We've come really close.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Brandon?
Yeah, I wanted to also briefly thank staff and you for this great project. I know that you've taken the lead here and recognized the opportunity on Philo Road and raised the bar with such a high-quality development, and I very much appreciate that and know that people in Ward 4 do as well. My one quick question to you is, you mentioned that the people, especially residents at Amber Point, appreciate being able to walk and bike to places on Philo Road, and I wonder in the site plan what you're doing and what your options are for getting some of the retail close to the Florida Road or the Philo Road frontages that are part of your site, so that the streetscape is really enhanced and there is some walkability on Philo Road and some connection there.
Because of the way we're built, almost all of the retail will be on the street sides of both Florida Avenue and Philo Road. The parking will be put back behind that. So all of it will be out there. and the signage and everything else to create that neighborhood type business atmosphere that we want.
Thanks.
Are we ready for a vote? Okay, all those in favor of moving this ordinance 2005-07115 to the council for approval, subject to completion of the exhibits, indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes. Thank you very much, Mr. Creek.
I'd also invite you to come out, those of you who haven't, and take a look at Amber Point Apartments. We're right on Amber Lane in Stone Creek, and some of you might like to see it.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Chris.
Okay, moving on. Now for consideration is ordinance number 2005-07116, an ordinance approving an extension to redevelopment agreement with Allen Strong. Bruce.
This is what happens when we don't exactly meet the terms of the initial agreement. We come back and amend it. I was going to mention that too. What you have before you is a request for an extension of a little longer than a year to continue to work on the site plan development for the Strong Banquet Center on Race Street. You have in your packet the original agreement and then this first amendment. The first amendment is very simple. All we're doing is postponing the repayment of the amount that we paid for demolition, which was $50,000 for this infill development. We're postponing the requirement to repay that back to the city for another year so that we can work on getting the site plan where we want it. So that is the request. I recommend that we do this. There's been some reasons that this hasn't gone forward in the time frame that we would like, and not all of it is under the control of the developer. And I think that this extension will do the trick, and hopefully we'll be able to get something back to you in terms of a development project shortly.
Questions or discussion? Dennis?
Is the project likely to be successfully redeveloped at the same site if the property, which seems to be in the center of the proposed development, doesn't change hands, but is retained by the owner of that property?
Let me address that. The property that you're talking about could be included or excluded from the development, either way. The problem is an easement that goes to that property. So we're not talking about the demolition of the property. We're not talking about the relocation of that owner. But what has to happen is a satisfactory agreement on an access easement. So that has to happen.
Why would there be the necessity of an access easement? What part of the property needs to be accessed?
There is a piece of property which Mr. Strong owns that fronts on Race Street. There is a landlocked piece of property owned by another party that's to the west of that property. There is an easement providing access to that. Mr. Strong had proposed putting the easement on one side of the property so that the building could be located in an appropriate way connecting to the Helmick property. There is a disagreement from the property owner in terms the adjoining property owner on that issue. So the project could go forward in a smaller scale. There's no question.
So my understanding then is that the lumberyard property and then the property that's owned to the north that goes maybe up to the corner are not joined at this time because of the this third party's property, which...
No, they're joined.
They are joined in the back?
They're joined in the front.
The front, okay.
They're joined. The issue is, where is the access easement? There's no definition to it. And one party thinks it's one place, which would work for their redevelopment, and another party thinks it should be somewhere else, which would hinder the development unless certain compensation were paid. So that's where we are.
All right. So we're hoping that within this coming year, a settlement between those parties can resolve.
And if it doesn't, then Mr. Strong has to make up his mind if he wants to go forward with a smaller project, which is possible. But as you recall from this project approval process in the past, the initial project included retail abutting onto Race Street, which was something that we encouraged the staff, and along with the banquet center that ran along and in parallel to the railroad right-of-way, which we thought was an efficient use of the land in that area. So I don't know that we can get all of that in there with the reduced site, but it is possible to go forward on a reduced basis. I'm hopeful that with this additional time that some appropriate compromise could be reached and this could go forward.
It's kind of, I know I've heard about this question, and I actually ended up talking one evening to the property owner. I met that person by chance, and there wasn't a map of the site to kind of illustrate, and I'm a real visual person, so without that kind of
I have several maps in my office that I'd be happy to.
It would have been, I guess I would have appreciated to try to visualize exactly where the problem was on the property and what the configuration of this banquet hall might be laying on the property, because I've of course driven up the street and seen the various lots that are empty at this point, but I couldn't visualize exactly where he was picturing this development to be.
I'd be happy to share with you and the rest of the council members our maps and exhibits on that.
Okay, because I don't think anybody here is really up on that development issue. So,
of course, this agreement doesn't really get into that. It just says we need more time to try to work this out, and I will at the appropriate time share the other maps and exhibits.
And I have no problem with extending the agreement.
Further discussion? Danielle?
I'd like to make a motion to send ordinance 2005-07-016 to council with recommendation for approval. Second.
There's been a motion made by Danielle Chenoweth and seconded by Heather Stevenson. Further discussion? See none. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. Motion carries. Thank you. Moving on to ordinance number 2005-07117, an ordinance revising the annual budget ordinance with regard to the water system audit. I believe this is Bill?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. What's before you is an opportunity for the cities of Champaign and Urbana to do a water system audit of the Illinois American Water Company, and this is something that was laid out in the recently renewed agreement, franchise agreement with the water company. There are certain aspects of what the audit would entail that are stipulated in the agreement, and we would hire a consultant that is familiar with performing water system audits, and it would be a not to exceed $20,000 contract. They would produce a report with certain recommendations that then we would work with the Illinois American to implement whatever those changes might be. The water company is aware of this measure that we're proposing to undertake. They're familiar with what we're wanting to do here, and familiar with wanting to hire a consultant to do the work. And what we have before you is a budget amendment ordinance then in order to drive the $20,000 per the franchise agreement. The water company would contribute $10,000, and the cities are splitting more or less on a population base, 6,500, 3,500 for the local city shares, for a total of $20,000. The audit shouldn't take more than 3-4 months. I would think by the end of the year we would have a report to share with you all on what the consultant would find.
All right, thank you. Is there discussion? Seeing none, is there a motion?
I move that we send ordinance number 2005-07-01-117 to council with recommendation for approval.
I second.
Okay, there's been a motion made by Danielle Chenoweth and a second by Charlie Smythe. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay. Motion carries. Thank you. Next, item number 8, ordinance number 2005-07118, an ordinance revising the annual budget ordinance with regard to the engineer and Windsor Road project. Bill.
This is kind of an interesting opportunity. A month ago, I have no idea about this, but things came to light in a recent response to a vacant civil engineering position in our department, and we were very pleased with the response. And So much so that it was one of those positions of, who do you select from a fine pool of candidates here? And we thought, maybe there's an opportunity here to look at a second position. And of course, you always have to look at how would that be paid for, et cetera, and how could it logistically work into the physical aspects of the building and layout and such. And anyway, we are able to do that and kind of outlined in this memo. But every year, there's always some consultants that we get involved with to do work. A lot of times it's specialized work that we don't have the in-house expertise, or quite frankly, projects might pop up that weren't planned for, like extending roads to High Cross Road and that sort of thing, and you need extra help that you don't have the people in-house to do. Well, one project that we are aware of that is a very large project, multi-million-dollar project, is Windsor Road. And this is a federally funded project, and this is between High Cross Road and Fowler Road. And it's not only addressing the existing deteriorated condition of the road, but it would be actually a widening of the pavement too. There would be medians, there would be left turn lanes added, there would be traffic signals installed, street lighting, some bike path work, etc. But the consulting fees for this project, and there's two phases, I need to be clear now. Because of the way federal funds would come to Champaign-Urbana area, we would receive a portion in fiscal year 08 and a portion in fiscal year 09. So it's unfortunate that that's the way the monies would be coming to us, but we'd have to literally break it up into two projects. So we have to find kind of a halfway point, if you will. So there would be construction over 2 seasons, or we would do it late in one fiscal year, early in another fiscal year, and kind of blend it together. But those are some logistic things we have to work out. But the point I want to make is that there would be over $1 million in consulting fees by the time you look at preliminary engineering, design, and then construction supervision on what's looking like about a $6.5 to $7 million project. So we believe that with the caliber of people that we have currently in-house, along with an additional engineer, this is a type of project that we could do in-house and still get other projects moving along too, even though this is a substantial project. We did do something almost identical to this back in the late 80s when we had the Windsor Road project between Ray Street and basically, well, Fowler Road and a little west of Ray Street. And at that time, the city employed a technician and an engineer to help with construction activities and engineering activities in lieu of consulting that work out. So I'm confident with the folks we have that we can do this type of thing with in-house staff, and that would be the funding, if you will, for this project, for this person, excuse me, for the next 4 years. It would certainly be stipulated that it's a 4-year situation. Unfortunately, like many organizations, turnover does occur, though, too, and 4 years is a length of time that some other people may come and go, too, or retirements or what have you. So it doesn't mean that that person would necessarily be out on the street after 4 years because of turnover, but I want to make it clear to this person, whoever it would be, that it's a 4-year commitment.
Charlie?
Okay, well, Bill just answered the question, my main question, which is, this is literally going to take money from Pile A and put it in Pile B, and as long as Pile B is reduced by the equivalent that Pile A is going up, I'm comfortable with it. But at the end of 4 years, if there isn't another project, we're not going to have an automatic staff increase. Right. So I'm comfortable with that. On the other hand, I'm disappointed that it sounds like this position might be so consumed by Windsor Road that we still have to turn around and get more help to do Florida Avenue. Or would there be enough given, or you're shaking your head no.
Well,
so.
I can't answer that this evening. Let me just put it that way. Quite frankly, if Florida Avenue extension was to happen next year, I'd have to get back to you in 1 or 2 weeks to answer that, and how we would provide the staffing for that, how we'd maneuver that. I can't answer that this evening.
Other questions? Brandon?
Yeah, I had a similar question to Charlie, and I wonder, in the 1980s when we had an arrangement like this, did the number of FTEs of civil engineers go up for 4 years and then go back down at the end of the project, or did we end up just enlarging Public Works
No,
permanently?
no, the FTEs were definitely reduced. And I'm reminded of that every so often, but that happened in the early 90s now. Bruce, maybe you could
Yeah,
speak more
and
to that.
what we did was to employ an engineer and a technician for the specific project of Windsor Road. This is a little more nebulous, but that's what we did. And the primary driver behind that was cost savings, because we can hire the engineer and do the design in-house, even if it's a multi-year project, more effectively and efficiently and for less cost than if we went out to have it done. So that was the thinking, and what we did is we provided a termination date for those employment. I don't know, we didn't really actually have agreements, we just had understandings at that back then. So that's what we did, and it worked out just fine.
Great, thanks.
Further discussion? I move that we send ordinance number 2005-07-118 to council for approval.
Second.
I would second.
There's been a motion by Heather Stevenson and a second by Danielle Chenoweth. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. Motion carries. Item number 9, ordinance number 2005-07-090, an ordinance amending the Health and Sanitation Code with regard to littering and dumping. Bruce, can you address this one?
This is a technical agreement in the ordinance, or a technical correction in the ordinance, and I have to put my hands on it again. Give me just a second. Got it? Okay. This came up in a recent situation involving legal, where there was a fine that was assessed in regard to littering, and to our chagrin, the minimum fine in the code was $250. Now, that happened at some point when we were changing the code or changing our fees. The suggestion is that was inappropriate, and that we should probably have a fee of $50 as our minimum fee. So,
Thank you for clarifying that. Is there discussion? Are there questions? Seeing none, I'll entertain a motion.
Second.
Somebody needs to make a motion.
I thought
I'll move to send this to council.
Thank you.
I'll second.
Okay, motion made by Charlie Smythe, seconded by Heather Stevenson. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay. Motion carries. Thank you. Item number 10 has to do with a mayoral appointment with regard to the Champaign-Urbana Joint Cable Commission and UPTV Commission. And the mayoral appointment is Mr. Durrell Cruz. And Mayor, would you like to say a few words about Mr. Cruz and the appointment?
Well, he has applied for this position. I think we've historically had people both on the CU Joint Cable Commission and the UPTV Commission. He's a former school administrator and has been on a number of boards and commissions, and he seems to be quite interested in this. So I would hope that you would approve it.
Okay. Charlie?
I move that we send this to council for approval.
Second.
There's been a motion made by Charlie Smythe, and it's been seconded by Brandon Bowersox to go ahead and move this to council. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
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 Those opposed, nay. Motion carries. Thank you. Next, we have 3 discussion items. And the first discussion item is regard to employee retention and recruitment. Bruce, would you please lead that discussion?
yes. On a couple of occasions now, the council has asked staff provide some information and some recommendations regarding our appointment process as it relates to employee retention and recruitment. Mona and I had a chance to sit down and to take a look at this and to work with Mayor and others in trying to figure out where we should be in this matter. And we have some specific recommendations to be discussed tonight. Let me start off with the issue of the annual appointment problem. One of the things that we discovered in both through anecdotal information from our own employees as well as review of the other forms of government and other governments in the area, is that we have a fairly large, what is considered a political appointee list. We have about 27 people that are appointed annually. This seems to be pretty large in terms of how other governments in our area deal with this issue. We did research some of the history involved with that, because the city code actually only provides for the CAO, the city attorney, and the department heads to be annually appointed. And so through part of my recollection and other discussions with folks that have been here for some years, tried to figure out how did we grow this list to be so large. And as it turns out, what had happened in the late 70s and 80s is that that was prior to the reform of our civil service system. We had some managers had concerns about how hirings were made at that time in terms of the number of size of the pool. It was a very limited pool. As you know, we have a very large pool now in order to promote diversity and other issues related to our goals at the city. But at that period of time, there was a movement to try to get people out of that system. So what happened is that a large number of managers were put on the annual appointment list to avoid the antiquated civil service system at that time. And of course, as many of you know, in the last 18 months or so, we've worked to reform the civil service system to provide for the goals of the city, including these larger employment pools, which have the effect over time to improve diversity. So that's what happened. Our suggestion now at this point is to go back to what the code says and to only go with the annual appointments of the 7 that I discussed. We did, take a look at some of the other communities in the area. Most of them that are our competitors or employment competitors are city manager forms of government. And as you know, in the city manager form of government, it's only the CA or the city manager that is annually appointed, and the city manager handles the rest of the personnel issues. The one city that's close by that is Mayor Aldermanic is Danville, and Danville does have a list of appointees. There are 10, including the city clerk. And they're appointed for 4-year terms. So that's the only close-by comp that we have of a similarly sized city. Most of the others are city manager forms of government. So in that regard, and I'm summarizing much of this information, the recommendation then is to just go back to the city code, have it provide the guidance in this matter, and reduce the number of appointees, and amend. To do this, we'd need a motion to tell staff to get back to work on the civil service code to re-include these folks into the civil service system. So that would be the method in which we would proceed in that manner if that's how you wish to proceed. Another matter that is related to this is length of employment. We have this situation where we have annual appointees, and by the code and statute, they are made once annually. So we're in the situation where we're in, May or April, and we want to hire someone from what's police chief or city attorney or whoever it may be. Well, the most we can guarantee them under that system is to the end of the fiscal year. Well, to some, that may seem like an undue risk or an issue. What we'd like to be able to do is, at least for the first year of an appointment, avoid having reappointment in that first 12 months. Again, all of this is based on performance. If we have any performance issues, we deal with that. But the political appointment process would not occur within the first 12 months. So that would solve the problem of coming to the end of the fiscal year and trying to do a hire with that hanging out there. And then lastly is what to do with the rest of the folks on the appointment list, or that would be left on the appointment list. And in that regard, we have suggested employment agreements. These employment agreements would be very similar to the one that was proposed for the city attorney. There have been agreements for the last, since we've had a CAO with the CAO by separate agreement, and then from time to time, the mayors have had separate employment agreements with department heads that may or may not have been approved by the council. More than likely were not. I know they were not. The suggestion here is to standardize those and have the city council approve them. And we've provided the standardized agreement that we used for the the most recent hiring attempt.
Okay.
So anyway, that's our recommendations to you. 1, reduce the list. 2, deal with the initial appointment so that there's not a reappointment within that first 12 months. And 3, for the remainder of those on that list, deal with this matter in the employment agreement fashion. Now, as you know, there are many factors that relate to employee retention and recruitment. There have factors relating to the amenities of the city, the workload, salary, pension issues. There are many, many factors, and we're not trying to deal with all of those in this memo. We're just trying to deal with actually the no-cost, low-cost ones to at least to start off with.
Okay, there are 3 issues here. Is it a group's pleasure to discuss all 3 at once or take them one by one? All 3 at once? Okay, all right, Danielle.
I have a couple of questions. The appointment not to occur in the first 12 months of employment makes a lot of sense. So I don't have concerns with that. Number 1 and 3, I have some concerns with. I think there might be ways to resolve those concerns, but they're outstanding. The issue with, well, let me ask a question. The proposal number 3, what I understand from reading this document carefully is that basically the mayor and the CAO can fire at any time, actually for any reason, that the people serve at the pleasure of the mayor. But this limits council powers to appoint at the end of a contract. So would it automatically be the case that you have a contract, say you have a 3-year contract, you wouldn't appoint every year, instead you would appoint after the 3-year contract is over in July with the new fiscal year. Is that the proposal?
Under this proposal, you would actually reappoint annually those 7, but not this full-page list. It's on the back. You would not.
But if you have a...
Those would be handled by civil service, but these 7 would be annually appointed. Now, in the contract, if for whatever reason those folks did not perform, then that would be dealt with as prescribed in the contract. If they were not reappointed for any reason by the council, then they would have a longer period of time, a notice period. And that's basically what we're getting at here.
But So
it would continue to be reappointed annually by the council.
Okay, so your contract wouldn't be like a 3-year contract. You could have a 3-year contract, but it would be subject to political appointment every year.
It is subject to political appointment every year. If the person fails at the job for reasons of performance, that's dealt with and they're terminated for reasons of performance. If they're not reappointed simply for a political reason in any one year, then they're given notice of that, which could run from 12 weeks to 3 months, at least initially.
And they also have some benefits that there's
and it's parceling out of benefits as well.
That makes sense.
So yeah, it would still be the annual reappointment process, but only for those 7. Now, one thing you might look at is on that last page, and I think what struck us was many of these positions on here really are not those that we need to deal with annually at this level, even if the code prescribed it. I mean, you have office managers, a fleet manager, operational supervisor, those types of things. And it's really unnecessary, in our opinion, to have those come to this level.
So the assistant police chief and the division chiefs of fire would not come?
They would not.
Okay. The second, I guess, the second is a question, and I don't have the answer. I was hoping to have an alternate proposal tonight, and I don't have a better idea at this point. So one of the most contentious votes on the previous council had to do with the division chiefs in fire. Also, we have an issue of the assistant police chief. Well, we have potentially a future vacancy of the police chief through retirement, and then the issues of the assistant police chief. And whether or not there'd be appointments. So we have some, and I believe we have a division chief who's retiring soon. So we have a situation where this council could be looking at approving appointments in these areas in the very near future, in the next 6 months. So it's an important issue on the table. My concern is that in fire, my concern has been that we have not adequately done enough as a city to promote internally. And so council has gotten involved at those times when council felt like there was not enough being done on the part of the administration to benefit the qualified candidates internally for certain positions. So I'm a little reluctant to give away that power as council, in part because it's been an important power that we've had in the past. It's raised important issues. We've been able to hopefully move forward with reforming our internal hiring process and promotions process as a result of those discussions. If that discussion hadn't happened, then we wouldn't have had the opportunity to improve our process. So I'm concerned about losing that opportunity to kind of improve our process. At the same time, I think we absolutely have issues of retention and hiring. This is the first I've actually heard that this was an issue, that the political appointment process was an issue. I have not heard that before now. I've heard issues of pay, I've heard issues of location, I've heard issues of, other kinds of issues, but not this. And so I guess I was a little surprised to see that this was the first reform that was brought forward. So I think there's some things that we could tighten up, but I'm concerned about, yes, there's some folks on this list that I don't think necessarily need to be appointed. I do think that, an economic development manager is a really important, and I have said this before, I think it actually should be a director level. It should not be a sub-level. And so if we move forward with your proposal, this council really doesn't have the same kind of review process for the economic development manager as we have currently. And I feel like that review process is important for kind of transparency and democracy. So I'm wondering if there's a way in which we can, a solution to provide assurances, like, for example, now that I understand it, I like the idea of having a contract in place. There are aspects of this contract that, I'm not sure if it's strong enough on the part of the employee, but I think that having a contract is a good idea. It's the issue of taking all the appointments off the table and the consequences for the city as a whole and the well-being of the city when we do that. I have concerns there.
Mayor Pressing.
Well, I think that this is a very serious issue, and it requires a great deal of thought and input from the council. So I would urge that this be done, over a period of time rather than just being rushed through, because it does have a lot of implications. I was surprised to see that whatever contracts we had not been to the council. So I have no problem with having contracts, and I worked with that on the the proposed one for the city attorney. But I do think that this is something that requires a lot of attention from the council, because it does change the whole structure. And some of these positions clearly should not be annual appointments, because it's just too low a level. But some of them, as you point out, you might want to have some input into. So I think it requires a great deal of study.
Bruce?
Just to address that issue a little bit, as we were talking internally about, who to include and what not to include, the first thing we did was look at the code, of course, and the code is very limited, actually, in what it provides for. It only provides for those department heads, city attorney, and CAO. So that was kind of our fallback, not knowing, because, quite frankly, we had talked about the possibility of putting division chiefs and assistant chiefs on the list, but then where do you stop? And so that was kind of some of the thinking on that. If the list is larger, that's fine. I think this list is way too large. But if this list is pared down, that's fine. The way to do it, to solve that issue, is to provide them the same type of employment agreement that protects, in the event that they weren't reappointed, that there's a long notice period so they can find additional. And that way you could solve the problem. So as long as they're not hanging out there in limbo, if they're either not on the list, that's fine. If they're on the list, that's fine as well, but then they need to have some sort of employment agreement to address that job security issue. So either way is fine. You could you could decide between you who you believe needs to be on this list. As long as those on the list have the employment agreement, that's fine. But there's no reason to have these office supervisor, information supervisor, those types of positions on here. So it's up to you. I think it can be addressed. Whatever direction, we're here to hear what you have to say and pursue that.
Charlie?
Well, I guess this is something I've been trying to push along because I think it's important that we get out of the political, get some of this stuff out of the political process. And where we draw the line is something we can discuss over the next couple of weeks, next couple of months if necessary, because it is going to take a while. I'm glad to see that I think we're all pretty much in agreement on the middle point, which is longer appointments. I guess I try to think about what the mechanics of that would be. Would an example be like, okay, suppose it's 3 months before the end of the fiscal year, we would just give them a 15-month appointment set, or would we do just do a 15-month appointment to the next cycle? What if it's, say, 6 months or 7 months, sort of halfway in between? What do we do then?
Well, I don't know yet.
Okay. Would we give them a year, or would we give them, an automatic year, and then it just comes up again?
I know what to do if it's really close to the end of the cycle.
Yeah. End of the cycle, it's no problem.
Right.
It's when it's further away.
Right.
7, 8, 9.
Well,
where do we draw the line?
It may be that each one of these will have to take into consideration on the initial appointment period, because you're going to make that initial appointment, and we may have to specify that initial appointment period in that contract.
So we just write the language.
Depending on when in the fiscal year that they're employed.
Okay. Going to the first point again, in terms of moving, whatever group we decide to move into civil service, how would that work? What would their contract be? What would their rights be? And so on. How would that work for them, for those group of people?
Well, simply what would happen would be that the positions covered by the civil service system would be amended to include these positions. And those positions would enjoy the rights, privileges, and obligations that each employee has under that civil service system. It's a system based on merit, and there's also due process involved in terms of termination. So it would assure a selection based on merit and termination based on due process. There is obviously a process involved in Civil Service Commission for employment that's handled by the personnel management of the city. There are, quarterly civil service meetings. The council appoints the civil service commissioners, and they are the overseers of the system to assure fairness and appropriateness in how we do business on the employment side for these employees. So we have the Civil Service Code of the city, and they would be a part of that.
Okay. And I haven't read that code yet, and I should go back and reread it. And it's been a long, long time. What does it do to, say, answer Danielle's question about hiring, encouraging hiring from within? Does civil service make it easier or harder to hire?
The civil service system makes it easier to hire from within. In fact, it's been the key tool that we've used to improve diversity at the city of Urbana. We're able to take positions. There are a couple of things that we did in the reform. I don't even know how long ago. It's been 18 months, maybe 2 years. One of them was to increase the pool and to get away from this notion of having a very limited pool that could be interviewed by the persons responsible for hiring at the city. We've changed that requirement so that there's a base level, so you're not just looking at who scores the best, but you're looking at a larger number of people that are qualified and meet the minimum requirements. So that helps. The second thing is in civil service, we're able to hire on a temporary basis or a part-time basis, and this is particularly true in public works, and able to take those people and hire them from those part-time temporary positions into full-time jobs through the Civil Service Commission and with the Civil Service Commission approval. We've done this several times in the Public Works Department. So that is a way that we can take people who are working for us in our seasonal and our temporary positions, or there can be professional temporary as well, and then move them into full-time positions. And that's one way, another way in which we have improved our ability to hire more representative of our population.
Okay. To follow up on that then, let me give you an example. Suppose, we currently have a planning division manager vacancy. If that position were civil service, how would hiring and filling that position be different from what we're doing now to fill that position?
Well, that would go through the system as opposed to simply going to the council. The recruitment would be very much similar. The job description would be approved by the Civil Service Commission as opposed to the personnel manager or myself. The recruitment would look very much the same. The Civil Service Commission would have a test, although a test could be simply a review of resumes, and would have a ranking, and they would certify a list. And then from that list or pool, the manager could make the appointment. In our case, we would make, in the current system, we would simply not have that step and would do the recruitment, do the reference checks, whatever, and then make a recommendation. I would recommend to the mayor, and the mayor would recommend to you.
Other discussion, Dennis?
It seems like this is a rather complex issue to work on. Some of them, like the middle point, seems to be somewhat straightforward and less problematic, perhaps. It would seem like we'd almost, it might be useful to treat each of the three elements separately, and it would occur to me that it might require a little bit of study and discussion, perhaps in a caucus meeting or something like that, to take this to some kind of a further development where we can actually have a drawn up plan or suggestion. And I think we have to look a little bit more into the Civil Service Code. I know I haven't read the Civil Service Code since being on council, and it might be useful. I'm not sure, what our preparedness level is to answer all of these questions.
Okay. Bruce?
Would it be helpful if we did a compare and contrast between the two systems so that you understand what we're... And I apologize, Mona's on vacation. Mona's really the expert on the civil service and is secretary of the civil service, so I'm just kind of pitch-hitting on that. But I think what we could do in the next week or two is give you a compare and contrast of the two systems so you understand it completely. And then also I can have Mona at the next meeting maybe to answer any questions that you have, or feel free to call us on it too if you'd like.
Robert?
I would also like to see some in-depth study on the statutory requirements as it relates to this form of government, so that we can take a quick look at that as well, and if there's any ramifications to the federal guidelines as well.
Yeah, I have actually done that, and I'd be happy to share that with you.
Okay, is there any other discussion? Charlie?
Yeah, Danielle touches on another item that is coming up, and that's how we deal with economic development. And my reading of the council is that via caucus and our goals is that we are interested in raising the profile of economic development to department head level. So that may answer Danielle's issue, in which case we'd have 8 individuals to appoint as opposed to 7, should we want to go that route. I guess the other thing to think about is, in looking through the list, is, do you want to draw the line at below or above assistants? And, the ramifications of that is you've got if you assume 4 division chiefs are assistants and fire division chiefs and 1 assistant police chief, an assistant city engineer, you add 6 individuals, raising the complexity from 7 to 13. But it's still a lot fewer than, it cuts it in half, in other words, if you want to do that. It would cut it in half. And I could see the logic of an assistant being appointed by the council. So I think that may be the, trying to figure out where to attack this and think about it That might be the level that we want to think about it over the next period of time. How important it is to go down to the assistant level on some of this. One of the possibilities, say, for example, on economic development, it could be, as opposed to being a head of a department, it might be sort of an assistant CAO type position, in which case, again, the issue that Danielle raises comes back. Or you could pick and choose from here. You could say, okay, certain assistants are, you could say, certain assistants you want to have appointment of, and some maybe not. So even there, you could move the line depending on what department it's in.
Danielle?
Actually, Robert has his hand up.
Okay, go ahead, Robert.
Another thought I had was, it seems as if when you make an appointment, you want to empower people to do certain things. And if it's the head of the police department, the head of the fire department, I think they would have, if you empower them, they should have the opportunity to pick a successor that they feel comfortable with. And I think that would be appropriate.
Danielle?
The only other thing to think about, and I agree with the mayor that this is a big decision. It seems like a small decision. Actually, we have to be thinking, 20 years out, and we have to be thinking about different councils, different mayor, different staff. We can't just be thinking about the particular staff in the particular situation. That's not good government. So a concern I have is the route that we're moving towards is that the mayor, the council, and the staff work together. And there's a kind of consensus process. I mean, tonight we had 7-0, because we worked together before things even get here to make sure that we have input into decision-making so that we can move forward in an efficient manner. When council's involved in the hiring process, as well as in the appointment process, and when we appoint people, it makes sense that we'd also be involved in the hiring process. That helps to build, it helps the glue of these different entities who need to work together. And so one concern kind of philosophically I have with removing lots of folks from this list, although I do agree that there's some folks who could be removed here, is that it's important for council to have a hand, not so much, Charlie talks about getting politics out of the process. I would actually disagree. I don't think of politics as a dirty word. Politics is us representing our constituents and working for the good of the city, and we have our hands in lots of different community groups and lots of different neighborhoods, and it's important for us to be able to represent those points of view, whether or not it's looking at making sure that we hire from within and we're giving opportunities, which helps retention process, whether or not it's looking at do we have minorities and women in senior level positions in our city, and council being involved in that process. So I think that as we move forward with this issue, we need to be thinking about making sure that we develop a structure that's not so overly burdensome or a disincentive for people to come to our community, and at the same time preserves the philosophy of us working together, us having stronger ties and stronger glue. When I first got on council, it's my understanding that council was not involved in major hiring processes. They were mostly left out of the process, and it was actually a fight tooth and nail at that time for council members to sit on some of the committees. So when we hired our Libby Tyler as the chief planner, it's my understanding, council had a big hand in that process. We've had a hand in the process of minority recruitment, and we've had a hand in the process of internal hires for fire. And I think that has been good. It's been a good process. It's made the city better as a result. So I want us to have caution in moving forward and thinking about making sure that we continue to kind of keep the glue. Otherwise, we have a situation where mayor and CAO and personnel manager may hire somebody, not a really good fit with the council, and then we have this kind of butting of heads. The other issue is accountability. We have a great staff right now. I feel that there is top-notch responsiveness. When I contact staff, I hear back from staff immediately. It's unbelievable. I don't have the same responsiveness in my own business as I have at staff here on, in the city hall. So, I feel lucky being in council chambers, and I think, it's a tribute to our staff. It's also the case that there is a structural component to that. These folks on this list know that there's an annual appointment process, and I feel like not so much that it's a stick so much is it's a glue that helps for staff to be integrated with council and to feel like that staff's not just speaking to the mayor at all times, but is really speaking to individual council members and is trying to address council member concerns. And in addressing council member concerns, that staff is addressing neighborhood concerns because we're set up on a neighborhood system. And so that, I think, kind of ties staff to the community on a more intimate level than just staff being accountable to the mayor and to the CAO. Enough said.
Any other discussion?
One more.
Okay, Robert and then Dennis.
With respect to what you said, I agree. But on the other hand, we cannot, when we're looking toward the future, we do not want to micromanage the system. We want to, make decisions that are sound, positive, and hopefully that the empowerment we give people will be a reflection of the embodiment of this group. And I think that if we have that thought in mind as we go forward, I think it would be very positive for the entire group.
Dennis?
And just as a thought, there's a huge number of people who live in the Urbana-Champaign area who work at the university who go on their jobs and have been there for 20 years, but who have annual contracts or reappointments required, and it doesn't stop the university from attracting excellent help. And I think it's a thought to consider more long-range contracts, and that it can be perhaps a useful tool in retaining good people, but it hasn't stopped the university from being an excellent employer. I think that the issues that are involved here do need a little more thought, and I don't know if it's going to be appropriate to bring them up at the next council committee of the whole, or if it needs to go into the caucus meeting perhaps, but I think it'd be too soon to forward it to council at this time.
Well, it sounds to me like we've asked, or Bruce has volunteered to provide us with some additional information. And I think we've given Bruce a lot of input tonight with regard to the council's feelings on some of these issues, which he can take into consideration. And then I think we have a caucus meeting coming up in about 3 weeks, probably, and because they're monthly.
Early August.
Yeah, in late August. So then is it the pleasure of the council to just continue to get input from this and then to discuss this at caucus at the next opportunity? Okay. Charlie?
We may be at the point where we need enough, where we might want staff input. I think it might be more appropriate to keep it in committee now that it's here. My regret is that I won't be here on August 8th.
That's a council meeting.
That's a council and committee meeting, I believe. So
15th is the next committee meeting.
15th is the next committee meeting. Okay, so yeah, that might be a time to get the rest of this. I guess there's one other aspect of this I wanted to bring up. The flip side. I'm not a fan of city manager form of government. Okay, and I agree with the responsiveness that we get. Okay, my idea is where do I point out, where do we draw the line on this? I think there are too many positions here. We do want to get some of them out of here. Where do we draw the line? If if I had to take a vote right now, I'd probably draw it below the assistants, for example. That's sort of where my comfort level is on this sort of thing. But I want to flush this all out. The other aspect, and this goes to what Dennis was saying, is for whatever group that we don't put back into civil service, we have these contracts. What should the contracts have as minimum termination notices and such? For those at the university, after you're there for 4 years, you get basically a year's termination notice, depending on the kind of appointment that you have, if you're full-time and so on. So that's a big termination notice, and I think that adds to why the university can bring in quality people. The proposal for the attorney was a 4-week termination notice that grows by a week per per year's service up to 3 months, I believe. I personally think that's too low. And so if people could think about what that is, and I think we may, debate this with the mayor and with each other as to what an appropriate minimum is, and then what the maximum we'd go to would be.
Mayor Pressing?
Well, I also have the same problem that Charlie has, that I'm going to be gone on August 8th, so I'd hate to see something big like this voted on without me being here. So I would really appreciate having a study session on it, because I don't think we're going to gain much by, acting faster rather than taking our time and doing what we really need to do.
We really should take our time.
Heather?
I agree with Mayor Pressing and Charlie. I'm also going to be gone, and you can still have a quorum, but I think that it's probably wise to maybe do a study session and continue this at a later time.
Okay. Brandon?
Yeah, I would appreciate, Bruce, the comparison of civil service to this employment agreement and kind of laying things out in a table where it's really easy for us to see the differences in all the categories. Another piece of information that I'd like you to provide is some brief comparison to area and region employers, both governmental units and units like the U of I that are not quite the same as just municipalities, of what contract terms look like for employees that are under these sorts of agreements. So what some sample terms of severance and things would be, so that we can see what other cities in the area and other groups like the U of I are doing.
Bruce?
I do have the answer to that question. They're really hard to find. I can produce since our employment competitors are primarily city manager forms of government. So we can provide you all the city manager contracts you want to look at because they're public information. The only other ones that we have available that are similarly sized, well, there are department head contracts in Champaign. I mean, you can look at those if you want. As far as other employment agreements outside of the city manager form of government, they're very difficult to find, because mostly they're smaller communities.
Danielle?
Just a quick other comment is if the contracts could have gender-neutral language, it'd be
That'd be good.
appreciated.
Okay, well, seeing no other discussion, I think we'll then rely on...
I think that's because that was the model for the city attorney. Now, the other thing is with the timing on this, the one thing that I would caution you, we can take our time. The one thing that may happen within that couple-month period is, depending on what happens with the city attorney search. And right now, we're proceeding on the basis that that will be an employment agreement employee.
So I think we're then, at this point, we're planning on a study session as soon as reasonable in terms of our schedule. Is that correct? Okay. All right. Moving on to item number 12, discussion with regard to the crosswalk at Vine and Windsor. And I would like the council to indulge me and allow me to turn the reins over to Mr. Bowersox for this item, so that way I can discuss it. Is that acceptable? Okay.
Okay,
Mr.
great. So
Bowersox.
maybe, Lynn, we could hear from you first, and then Public Works, and then open it up for discussion.
Okay, thank you. All right. I'm from Ward 7, of course, and I know that as I was campaigning and as I've continued in getting feedback from constituents, that the crosswalk at Vine and Windsor continues to be an area of concern. As you know, Meadowbrook Park is located there, and it's not only a local draw, it's a regional draw, really, with people coming far and wide on cars, bicycles, by foot, by rollerblades, to visit that park. And I've talked to Mr. Gray on many occasions, and he's been very helpful in terms of providing information to me about kind of the situation as it stands. And but I think it's worth a little bit further discussion, and then potentially, depending on how the council feels, maybe further direction to our staff with regard to this issue, because I continue to hear significant concerns about the safety of that area. And there's pretty overwhelming support for some type of more aggressive activity at that area in terms of controlling traffic.
At this point, yes, other questions? Go ahead.
Well, I have to echo what Lynn said. I often try to cross Windsor Road at that point, and it is very difficult for pedestrians, and it's also difficult for drivers. I don't think I'm ever going to try to make a left turn from Vine Street onto Windsor again, because it's very hard to time all the traffic coming there. So I'd like to see some kind of improvement for both pedestrians and drivers.
Yeah, Danielle?
I have a question about this for Mr. Gray. It's my understanding that a human-controlled light, which might be a solution to this, where it only turns red when the human being actually pushes, I need to cross now, is potentially not appropriate because the traffic counts are such that at that intersection that it's not appropriate. But my question is, and this might be the missing piece, is when you look at standards for putting a light up, do you ever do pedestrian counts or bike counts, or is it just that you're doing traffic counts? Because I keep hearing traffic counts, but I don't see the pedestrian in the picture.
The warrants for traffic signals do include pedestrians, yes, and delays and numbers of pedestrians that cross per hour, peak hours throughout the day. Those counts are also included.
So we have counts for that intersection for pedestrian crossing?
Yes.
Okay.
Just maybe a brief history of the intersection. I know some of you know this by heart probably by now, but when Prairie Play was completed, we immediately received these comments, concerns that you've been hearing, and on 2 different occasions we've done a full engineering study of the intersection. The most recent one, I think, was perhaps now 2001 or 2. Kuwat staff, professional engineer, transportation engineer, did that study, and still have come up to the conclusion that traffic signals are not warranted there at this time. We try to be very careful where we do put traffic signals in the community. There are locations where we have 4-way stops where signals are warranted, but we haven't proceeded with that for various reasons. But this is a particular intersection that just hasn't met that threshold yet. With that said, in recognizing that it is difficult for pedestrians to cross a very wide roadway, we are poised to restripe Windsor Road, and this is, we're going to restripe Windsor Road in a way that we're effectively going to create, rather than a 12-foot wide travel lane on Windsor Road, it would be an 11-foot wide lane, and we are going to create a median refuge, if you will, where pedestrians can cross at least in one direction, get midway there, and have a safe spot in the middle of the pavement to stop, and then look for cars in the other direction to then make that crossing. Rather than right now, it's basically you got to look at crossing essentially 5 lanes and be sure you have that gap east and westbound traffic. Now you could, depending if you're going southbound, you look for the westbound lanes, get across middle of the way, and look for the eastbound traffic, get those, wait for the gap and then cross. So it'll be a easier / safer way to get across. So we're poised to do that. We finally received, there aren't too many striping contractors in the central Illinois area, and that's what we were trying to get proposals from. We got some as far away as Chicago, actually. But we're ready. We're poised to enter into a contract now, unless there's some other direction I get this evening, of course. But I have those plans. I've had them looked at. 2 different engineering experts to confirm our ideas are sound and they have sound basis to them. So we're comfortable in doing this, and we'll gauge the reaction from there. But I have heard somewhere, and I wish I could wave my magic wand to make it easier to cross, but those are kind of the constraints we've lived with so far.
Danielle, another question?
Just a follow-up question. It sounds like that's kind of providing pedestrians refuge, but it isn't doing anything to control or calm traffic in any way, and I feel like that's a baby step in the right direction. I understand it's a step, but it doesn't seem sufficient to me. There's a crosswalk there, right, currently.
Striped crosswalk, yes.
And it's state law that cars stop when a pedestrian is in the crosswalk. Unfortunately, in this town, for some odd reason, not in San Francisco, not in Asheville, not in Madison. I mean, I traveled to all kinds of towns where I step in the crosswalk and the traffic stops, and it's magic. I've never seen anything like it before here. But here, I cross downtown, for example, is a perfect example. Crosswalk, people are crossing all the time to go to Maribel's. Cars never stop. I mean, I have had conversations with SUVs in the middle of the street through their windows saying, excuse me, but did you know that it's state law for you to stop at this crosswalk when there's somebody in the crosswalk? And please do not get a foot away from my skin as you're going across this pedestrian crosswalk. But it's really a driver education thing that people in this community do not know that is against state law and actually quite hazardous for you to enter a crosswalk. Now, there's a couple of pieces to that I think are cause for that. One is, with the exception of U of I recently, we don't really have signage except a person and an arrow saying this is a crosswalk. But it doesn't say $500 fine for running a crosswalk when pedestrians are in it. I think it should say that. I think it should say $500, you pay it if you go through this crosswalk when people are in the crosswalk. And I think there should be a thing in the middle of the road, and maybe if this refuge would have provided, that they have now on Goodwin on campus, where all of a sudden it lets people know there's pedestrians who cross here. It's magic. I can actually cross there now. I couldn't cross there before, but they put this in the road, and I can cross now. So that's another issue. And then the third, I guess, in terms of traffic calming is there a way to decrease from, say, Lincoln to Philo Road, the speed limit at that location? I guess a fourth thing would actually be step traffic enforcement, so that there should be police officers who sit and teach people that they will get tickets if they go through the crosswalk when there are people in it. We aren't seeing that right now. We see, speeding, but we don't see that. So I guess there are some other traffic calming things that we could do that aren't $100,000 lights and potential liability, as I understand it, although I still would like to see the human being push the button, the light turns red, the person crosses the street. To me, that's a safe alternative, and I'm still not convinced that's not the right alternative, but maybe some of these other things we could look at. So I guess I'm interested in your response to those ideas in addition to the restriping.
Maybe in reverse order. The STEP program, and Chief Adair can jump in, but that is a continual location, and we do radar there frequently, and there are reports attached to the Traffic Commission monthly minutes that you'll see STEP results basically each month at those locations. So that is an area that is patrolled frequently, perhaps close to weekly. And
for speeding, correct, but not for pedestrians in the crosswalk? Because I have noticed that they're speeding, but not... For
speeding, yes. Okay. With regard to the driver attitude of failing to yield, that certainly goes beyond this intersection, and that's a whole different problem to tackle, I guess. And it's just, it's attitudes and ultimately enforcement and education are part of that endeavor, and it's true. Champaign-Urbana and other areas throughout the state have these types of issues. Why the yield signs aren't out in the at this location in the median compared to campus, we're very concerned about those signs being at this location for a variety of reasons. We have where we've studied and we're continuing to study their effectiveness, and we've had, quite frankly, mixed reaction to those signs. When you have multi-lanes, more than one lane in a direction, the pedestrian sees a car slowing or yielding, but fails to see the inside lane car not yielding and then gets hit. And we've had that situation on campus. So here we have and speed limit is 25 miles per hour on campus. This is a higher speed limit. We do have speeding, people driving in excess of the speed limit there. I think where we have had to date, and I'll knock on wood, we have not had a pet accident there to date. This could be inviting that type of situation if we did those types of signs out there. Speed limits, to artificially lower the speed limit is not advisable. There are certain rules and methods that we look at in setting speed limits, and if you would artificially lower the speed limit 10 miles per hour on Windsor Road, you essentially would be doing is just increasing the drivers would basically be driving in excess of that speed limit, because they feel more comfortable with the type of lane and roadway that it is. Now, with that said, by striping the lanes from 12 feet to 11 feet, we're going to hope to get a more contained or close feel that might have an effect of traffic calming. I mean, studies have shown that narrower lanes do slow traffic speeds down, and through striping out there, perhaps we can cause that to occur. But you know, when that road was built, it was built to state and federal standards, and it's wide, and it's no different than you'd be on Interstate 74 with the lane widths out there. I don't necessarily like to design roads with that kind of lane width, because that does give the driver a feeling of safer to go at a higher speed. So violation rates would be very high if we would just arbitrarily lower the speed limit. So that's a constraint we have there too. Let's see, is that the 4 items?
What about the light, human-controlled light?
Oh, a pedestrian, well, that pretty much falls in the same category as a traffic signal in general. You wouldn't just put a ped light there, it would be a full traffic signal light, so that you would also address the Vine Street traffic at that time. And not just ped only, but you would address, you know, the Vine Street vehicles that would go through or right or left onto the Windsor Road.
Okay, next we'll hear from Lynn, and then maybe Dennis after that. Lynn?
I think exactly for the reasons that you've talked about, the wide road, the 4 lanes, and the speed, to me it kind of speaks to why nothing in between, you know, nothing and a stoplight kind of fits the bill. You know, so a stoplight really seems to be the safest choice, because these other ones are just, well, you know, we're going to hope it works, but it could be in a situation where you, again, have people feeling safer than what they really are. And I think the median, though, does give a place for people to stop. When you have women with baby carriages and dogs, and, you know, I don't, it worries me that you then have kind of this grouping of people and little kids out in the middle of a highway where people are often going 45 miles an hour.
This will be wide enough to accommodate that. So if you have bicycles and dogs and carriages and such, the median width, I mean, that's a specific part that we want to be sure that we had enough median width there to allow for that. And sure, it'd be wide enough for several people, actually, now not 50, of course, but you know, we don't see those kinds of queues going across, but it will accommodate strollers and bikes and that sort of thing.
Dennis?
Well, I really do have to disagree. The median is a thoughtful consideration. I have come and gone from the Vine Street side down to Meadowbrook Park many times, and visibility to the east isn't exactly great if you're in a car, and I often wondered how so many people who live in the neighborhood immediately north of Windsor have made it across the street for so many years without having a fatality. To me, this has the very same feeling as that low sign by the courthouse on Elm and Vine, where it logically it was there by right, it was low enough, you wouldn't think it was a problem, it was just a little insignificant sign, but when you're actually using the corner, it's a big problem. And I think that the city owes it to its citizens to very seriously consider what they want to do with traffic control at this intersection, because it's a feed line to the most popular park in the city, which has actually insignificant parking to access the park itself. There's so many people who want to go to that park, and many of them do it on foot with dogs, with baby carriages, and they are basically running, you know, I don't know, was it 10 lanes or whatever it is, And, you know, it's a little scary, and the traffic, it's a major artery in the city, and traffic is moving fast. Now, at Lincoln, there's a four-way stop, and it doesn't hurt anybody's feelings, and nobody feels oppressed to come to a full stop and then continue on their way. And I think that even though it's rather close to that location, this particular site, since it's also in a little bit of a dip, and there are certain problematic features about its position on Windsor Avenue, requires, I think, a more considerate, a heavier hand in solving it. And I don't think I could accept anything less than a full stop or a traffic signal at this location. I don't know if the rest of the council feels this way or not, but even though the requirements according to code or something wouldn't require it because of its various structural uses and the traffic count, I think by logic and by human standards, it's a dangerous intersection. And I just think it would be appropriate, and I think a lot of people would appreciate the city for taking a little more of a drastic step in correcting it. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, Robert?
At what point would you think of overhead?
Generally, the state has some guidance on overhead or underpass, and we don't come anywhere near the volume, the number of people. I mean, it's hundreds of people per hour is where you get to the point where you would, want to go to that expense. And the accessibility, there really isn't room there to do it, quite frankly, to ramp an overhead or an underpass situation. It would be a really extremely expensive situation, but if you wanted us to look into it, we could. But I just know from experiences in other locales, it has to be pretty high volume to really, a pedestrian crossing volume to really want to warrant something on the order of what you see on campus.
Charlie?
Yeah, I think a four-way stop would be a lot cheaper than a bridge or an underpass. The funniest sight I've seen at that intersection is a council member on rollerblades with a dog. And I stopped for you.
Thank you. But I was scared because I didn't know whether the other car was going to stop.
No, well, that's the problem. The car, the other coming the other way. Now, the way I understand the state law, and maybe Chief Adair can explain it, I'm under the impression that at these intersections, it's when a person enters the lane that you're on. If you're going west, and the person comes in on your right, you're required to stop. But if they step on the left, and you're coming in, you don't have to stop. That was the way I sort of read that, and I don't know if that's really the case. That's a little bit different. When I first came to this town, I came from a college community where everybody stopped at all the crosswalks, and I almost got killed the first week I was here. Chief, you want to explain? Am I misreading that law on the crosswalk?
I would have to check and get back with you, but it's my understanding if it's just 2 lanes, you have to stop.
Regardless?
Yeah.
Okay.
But not, that wouldn't be applicable to Windsor, though.
Right, okay,
The intersection we're speaking of, because that's, I believe, 5 lanes there at the intersection we're speaking of.
Yeah, so, if it is the situation where on a 4 or 5 lane, they don't have to stop unless they're on your side of the road, that gets real confusing. And even at 4-way stop, the 3-way stop at Nevada and Lincoln, I've been brushed back by a car twice, and I know people who have been hit there several times, Brandon being one of them. And, there's a stop sign and people don't stop and you get hit. My question for Bill would be, what are the warrants for a stoplight at Race and Windsor? And I'm thinking, if we put a stoplight at Race and Windsor and then a 4-way stop at Vine and Windsor, would that have a positive effect or on safety? Race and Windsor?
I would have to check, but I believe that
there's a traffic light at Race and Windsor is what I'm thinking.
I believe that's an intersection that would warrant traffic signals. I would need to confirm that, number one. Number two is Philo and Windsor warrant traffic signals, and there would be a better situation of setting up gaps there, because you'd have those times when Windsor would be stopped at those respective intersections. You would introduce better gaps than right now with cars, and it's kind of what happens on Lincoln Avenue too when you cross my campus. You have that kind of bleeding effect of a car comes every few seconds, and you don't have as many gaps. So admittedly, signals at the Philo and Ray Street areas would probably introduce more gaps, when, at least during those peak hour times.
Maybe combined with providing some space in the middle, that might be enough. Are lights included at Philo and Windsor as part of the reconstruction?
Yes.
Okay, so is it $200,000 to do a light?
Well, it depends on the location. The traffic signals themselves, equipment, are typically in the $100,000 to $125,000 range, but many times there are geometric improvements that need to be done at an intersection, and it just depends on the complexities that add cost to the roadway improvements. So at Philo or even at Vine and Windsor, you're probably looking more in the $100,000, $125,000 range.
Danielle?
What would, two questions. One is, the light at Philo and Windsor is in our CIP plan then, because it's part of the reconstruction?
Correct. In
What year is
FY
that?
08, 09.
Okay, 08, 09. And is there a light in our CIP plan for Race and Windsor the next 10 years?
I don't believe so, but I would have to confirm that.
Okay. And what's the last council had this conversation, this council is having the conversation. It appears, without speaking for council members, that there's a pretty strong majority sentiment that something needs to be done here, and that it needs to involve something that, both isn't misleading and is also pretty firm, like a stoplight or a stop sign. What would, if a majority of council members here voted on a motion to say, do it, put a stop sign or a light here, tell me what the consequences of that vote would be for you and for the city?
Well, I first of all probably want to talk to our legal staff on responding to that. But generally, you don't want to install items that are unwarranted. I guess the worst case scenario is that if you have a stop sign, all-way stop that's not warranted, for example, and if someone was to have an accident and someone was to take the issue to matter to court and it was determined that it was an unwarranted installation or whatever, one could maybe have some standing, if you will, in either having it removed or perhaps fault or no fault might be the case, depending on the situation. So,
is there case law that supports that in the state in the recent past? I mean, is there any case where someone actually, not the getting it removed, but actually sued a city because they found that the traffic studies weren't such that it warranted a stoplight or a
yeah, I can't answer that.
Okay.
That would have to be researched. I am personally familiar with a situation where someone that had time and money took a community to task in having them remove unwarranted stop signs in the Chicagoland area. As far as traffic signals, again, I guess logic tells me there's a similar relationship, but again, it would take some case law study to be able to answer that question. I think, if City Council, passes the appropriate ordinance and wanted to proceed with the traffic signal and fund it accordingly and go forward, my guess would be that our exposure would be extremely low, that because it was done, maybe not meeting all the warrants. But again, I would seek a legal opinion on something like that.
Our exposure would be low,
Very
meaning
low.
Our legal liability would be low?
Would be very low, right.
For a traffic signal as compared to
If it
stop
didn't meet
signs, or-
warrants, yeah.
Okay.
I also want to say something that, with stop signs or with traffic signals, those induce accidents too, okay? And just by their nature, you have certain types of accidents with either of those type of installations. And so you're going to trade situations off with whatever currently is occurring there now with different types of accidents that will occur when you introduce signals or stop signs. And I can also tell you that if something is marginally warranted or not warranted, drivers do pick up on that, and you begin to breed violation of those devices. So if a stop sign, for example, is an always stop there, and you're a frequent user of Windsor Road, and every time you go at 7 in the morning to work, you never see anybody on Vine Street, especially at Prairie Play, it breeds the rolling stops or no stop at all. And heaven forbid, when that person jogs at 7 in the morning, is leaving Prairie Play to leave, and he sees someone coming to a stop, pulls out, and gets hit. And unfortunately, those situations happen too. So you're trying to manage risks at all levels, and there's not a cure-all, whether it's traffic signals, always stops, or what have you. And we look at these items very closely throughout the city with respect to accidents at intersections. We're constantly tweaking signage, striping, adding stop signs, maybe going to signalization, whatever the case may be. We have the assessment that does occur by our CUOT staff. We receive reports annually, and they give us reports on what's going on out there. They receive the police department reports at all these intersections, and they highlight areas that are for us to be highlighted. And unfortunately or fortunately, however you want to look at it, accidents are a trigger point to tell us we have problems at certain locales. And we focus then on those problem areas where we have high accidents. Peds, bicyclists, whatever, motorist accidents, whatever they are, those we look at carefully and try to address.
Just a quick follow-up question on what you said. In the situation of traffic signalization, it seems like the biggest argument against it is budget, because it's my understanding, and I don't fully understand these things, is that if there's a traffic signal, it's triggered by a car. Like, say that traffic signal would always be green on Windsor except for when there's a car or a person pushing a button on Vine trying to get across. Is that correct? So it would stay green. It wouldn't just turn red sometimes, but it would always be that way until a car actually came and triggered it. Is that right?
It depends on the intersection. Where your volumes in all directions are more or less equal, that typically isn't the case. It's going to cycle on a 60 or 70 or 80 second cycle length. Okay. But some locales where we have a disproportionate traffic volumes, and I'll use Orchard in Florida as an example. Florida, it may dwell green for a long, long time, where a car on Orchard would then send a signal to the controller to say there's a call, a presence of a vehicle, and to change it. So again, without getting into the studies further, that may be a situation, as you suggested, Vine, because the traffic volume isn't as great there. But again, why you put always stops or why you put traffic signals up is that generally all 4 legs or 3 legs of intersection are the volumes of traffic are fairly equal. It's not where you have 90% of the traffic of the total intersections on an east-west corridor and only 10% on a north-south. That's disproportionate, and that's can be problematic. So, I guess just I hear you loud and clear, and we can revisit this again. It's been probably 3 or 4 years since we've studied it. I do know that volumes are increasing, on Windsor and on Vine as we've developed and grown and what have you, and maybe we should just revisit and do an updated study, and also at that time perhaps look at some other solutions here that we're not thinking of. We don't have all the answers, and I'm the first to tell you that we don't have all the answers, but we thought that this striping modification would be a way to help folks cross and feel a little safer about crossing rather than trying to think they have to go across 60 feet of pavement. They can worry about 25, 30 feet at first and then get the other parts. So
my suggestion to Lynn and Laurel would be to tell your neighbors to drive on Vine Street and empty onto Windsor. And if you
Yeah.
do that, you'll increase traffic counts.
Yeah, that would
And
help.
then the studies will show that there's enough people on Vine to actually warrant a signal. That,
We
you
need to know
the
the day,
grassroots
though.
approach. The grassroots approach to signalization.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, Heather?
Since we really can't make a motion because there's not an ordinance, why don't I suggest that the public bring their concerns and their ideas to their prospective council members through email, through telephone, whatever the case may be, and we can continue this discussion and revisit this at another time.
Yeah, it sounded to me like there were a number of questions from people. A few didn't have answers, like the timing of the CIP for some of these intersections and data about pedestrians. And Bill, you suggested maybe bringing this item again back onto the agenda to give some of those updated detail and do a little more study. Are there any other questions tonight or any other action that people recommend? Bill, first.
Well, I guess where I was going was the idea of, if we're going to have a traffic light at Windsor and Philo anyway, what we should consider is at the same time getting a light at Race and Windsor. I think that combined with narrowing the road and adding the median may be enough to create that gap that people need. Because I think it really is 90% of traffic's going one way and 10% the other way. It's the pedestrians that need to cross. I don't know. That's just my gut. That's my gut reaction. But that or two lights and a four-way stop. That's sort of like the way I'm thinking about it.
Mayor?
I think there might be more pedestrians crossing at Vine Street than there are on Race Street. Because I crossed both places, and Race and Windsor has a four-way stop, and even that sometimes is very hard to get across. But you're talking about intersections that have disproportionate traffic. Well, the one at Lincoln and Windsor, the light just changes when there's traffic that needs to get on from Lincoln, and that seems to work pretty well.
Heather?
My gut tells me that the reason there hasn't been a pedestrian accident there to make note of is because of the stop signs at Race and Windsor and at Philo and Windsor, and people just don't, speed up their cars at, from those points, and that's, I know it is what the speed limit is, but I would guess that the people who travel Windsor Road travel it more than just once in a while, that it's something that they know is there, and that has a lot to do with why there hasn't been. And I know it's a concern, and I don't want to underestimate that concern. I just am suggesting that that's probably why there haven't been noted pedestrian accidents there.
Bill, did you have some response to these last few comments?
I did. I guess
Yeah, go ahead.
timing's everything, but we are poised to go ahead with the striping change out there. Should we proceed with that, or do we want to hold off pending further discussion, or what's your pleasure?
From what I understand, the cost of the striping is minimal.
It's a few, it's
So
$7,000, I think we're talking about here.
I
We
mean,
have to remove the existing, we have to grind that off and put new on, so.
So I think regardless of whether or not we decided to go with a light or stop signs, there's still going to be a time passage where I think it would be important to go ahead with this
Okay.
move.
Okay.
So that we can have some
Assess
degree of
it.
increased safety.
Okay.
Charlie?
Real quick, how far in each direction is the striping going to change?
I want to say 300 or so feet in each direction, so it's the whole intersection taper area with
And
enough
how
turn lanes.
wide
And
is
excuse
the
me?
median? How wide is the painted median?
Oh, boy, at least 8 feet, I believe, the median, painted median. Mhm.
Mayor?
And will you have more signs to warn drivers that there's a crosswalk coming up?
You know, if you look at the intersection, we have just about every sign we can possibly put out there to let folks
the ones
know.
out there.
So we don't have the $500 sign yet, but.
You don't have the ones with the arrow
Yeah.
pointing
They're
to
sitting
the...
in his
Yeah.
vehicle.
There's a new green fluorescent type looking color that we might want to introduce. We've not gone into that phase out yet, but that's a new METCD color sign that does attract attention, and that's something we'd like to, there's a couple locations when we start buying those types of signs, we'd like to put those in. But other than that, it's striped per METCD requirements, and the signage, the striping. So if you're a motorist and you're alert and you pay attention to signs and striping, it's all there. I don't know what more we could add.
Dennis?
Is the median, which you just described as being 8 feet wide, that's the safety island?
Yes.
Is it a raised or not raised?
It's not raised.
It's flat.
And at
Road
this
surface.
time, right, and it may go to a raised median. That's part of our review. I didn't want to go into that extraordinary expense to do that work, but if this appears to be receptive, and I'll invite comments from the public as to what they think, it could be a raised median.
Because we're ready to go to a stop sign or a signal. So, I mean, I think your hesitancy can be removed.
Any other questions?
Just saying that that's another aspect in the iterative approach here.
Any other discussion? Okay, with that, Lynn, you can proceed
Okay.
as chair.
All right, we're ready for item number 13, and this is a discussion on the IDOT report on racial profiling. And Danielle, I think this is one that you may want to lead the discussion on.
Yeah, thanks, Lynn. I put this on the agenda, and I think there's a couple of things. I also put in the packet a note from Chief Adair and some information from the city of Urbana. They produced a pretty extensive document that goes over both. Their data is a little different than ours, but goes over specific action items that they're taking to respond to some concerns. There's a couple of differences between Champaign and Urbana that I think are significant. One is that in Champaign, in terms of the rate of equipment versus traffic violation stops, consent searches, and citations versus warning rates, we see a inequality. And I'm in particular, IDOT talks about minority stops. I'm interested in African American versus Caucasian, and there are other categories we can discuss, but my particular, I think that minority groups are not all the same. They're not treated the same. There's not the same kind of histories. I think Asians are really different than African Americans are different than Latinos in terms of the histories and treatment and kind of grievances. And so I want to disaggregate those things, but that's one thing to take note. So I think that their report really focuses on those things as it should. In Urbana, we don't have that same kind of issue. We do have, at least if you take the statistics, and I understand that the statistics are based on residents, not based on drivers, and it's difficult to get those numbers. So I understand that, but looking that Urbana stops are 34.5% to a driving population estimated of 12%. Champaign is 33%, estimated driving population of 13%. And I guess when the report came out, I heard, well, Urbana's better, and there was silence. And I just think that that's not good enough. We should hold ourselves to higher standards than Urbana's better than Champaign in terms of its police department. I happen to agree with that sentiment, but I also think that it's not something that we shouldn't sit on our laurels. The thing that kind of concerned me the most is looking at the state report. The average rate is 1.15, whereas Urbana's minority rate is 1.47. And so the question is, and the argument has been made, the chief made this in the article with the News Gazette, and I think it's a compelling argument, which is more African Americans, the argument was made, more African Americans commit crimes, there's more police activity. I'm actually not sure if more African Americans commit crimes. I think they commit crimes that they get caught for. More often, they're more street-level crimes, whereas I think Caucasians also commit crimes, probably in same kind of levels, but it happens behind closed doors. There's more protection, et cetera. So I think that's part of the thing. There's more street-level crime with police being called in to respond to those crimes. And so we see more police activity in the area, and so there are more stops because there's simply more police activity, and we live in we have a segregated town here still, and so we see predominantly African-American neighborhoods versus predominantly white neighborhoods, with some neighborhoods that are mixed. So the issue then is, why wouldn't it be the case for all communities? Because we have segregation in all the communities in the state of Illinois. Why would the rates in the state average be 1.15, but the rates here be 1.47? So that's one issue. I guess the other issue is, even if profiling is not happening, and I think that it's important, instead of saying no, profile isn't happening, for us to really look critically at this. But even if profile is not happening, and it's that police activity is in these particular predominantly African American neighborhoods, there's a police presence, a sense of siege, I would put it, that I've heard profiling arguments for a long time from African Americans in this community. But there's a sense of, how do we have police presence in neighborhoods so that there's a addressing of crime? It's not that we don't want police to go into particular neighborhoods, but not to then have it be a sense of a presence where people are being stopped. I mean, I talked to African American youths who told me that 4 times in one day, both in Champaign and Urbana, they were stopped because they're young and they're male and they're African American. That was their description. That was their perception. They were stopped 4 times in one day. They had no equipment violations. They had no moving violations. They had no drugs. They had no. So this was their perception, that the cops are out to get them. And so what do we do to address that perception? And also, what do we do to get at the root of, if there is racial profiling happening? And I think there's some compelling data here to look at. What are the action items that we take? So I guess that's what I put on the table. And I'm happy to see the Chief of Police before us, and I'm interested in what he has to say.
Well, I can only respond to what information we were required to collect by the Northwestern study. And some of what you asked for, we don't attempt to collect. And the estimated driving population is information, again, determined by Northwestern on this study, and the ratio also is determined by the University of Northwestern. And you're correct in what the state average is, but you have to take into consideration the demographics of the state of Illinois. Making traffic stops in central and southern Illinois, if that community isn't traversed by the interstate or even a U.S. highway, the likelihood of stopping a minority or an African American in particular in those counties is almost nil, non-existent. The demographic of Illinois is that African Americans in particular are in population centers. They're not in rural Illinois. And if you go to Ford County, any of our surrounding adjacent counties, you're going to find almost non-existent of African Americans. Now, if that county is dissected by an interstate, you can go on the interstate and make minority traffic stops because they're traversing, going from point A to point B by way of the interstate. To a lesser degree, you can also do that on U.S. highways. Get on a state highway like 130 and drive 50 miles south and just stop and do a survey. Count how many African Americans you see in those vehicles. It'll be almost none, because we tend to be in population centers. So certainly, if you're in areas and you have no minority, certainly it's places that have ratios far less than 1. They have ratios of 0, because it doesn't occur. But when you get into Chicagoland area, here, Bloomington Normal, Springfield, and places like that, sure, you're going to find minorities. And that's where you get the discrepancies. The numbers go up, especially us and Springfield, because both communities are dissected by 55 and 57. That's two of the heaviest travel interstates in this state because of its connection to St. Louis and to Memphis. And you go there, and roughly 30% of the vehicular car traffic is minority. So it has to do with the direction of travel that the citizens take, and we're not in control of that. But you'll find a very high traveling population of minorities and African Americans on Interstate 57, and likewise on Interstate 55, which goes through Springfield to St. Louis.
Could I just for the sake of the conversation, I don't mean to interrupt you, but a clarification is when I looked at the study, I had that question too, what is the ratio? And my understanding initially was incorrect. It was your understanding, which is, well, of course that the state of Illinois has 1.15 because it's mostly white folks in the center of the state, in the non-population centers. But I looked at where the numbers came from, and actually the ratio is based on the demographic of that area. So the ratio goes up and down based on how many minorities are in a particular population. So it should be the case that in every community, a ratio of 1 means that the stops in that community match the demographics of that community. So it is context specific, which is why the number 1.47 is a cause for consternation, because it's 1.5%. So basically, African Americans are 50% more likely to be stopped in Urbana based on their population in Urbana than they would in the state, where they're only 15% more likely. So that's my reading of those numbers, and so
based on the estimated driving population.
That's correct.
And understand, we're speaking, this study speaks only to traffic enforcement, okay?
Mm-hmm.
That's all it speaks to. And you're correct in your interpretation of that number, but what you have to look at, and unfortunately I didn't provide you with that, is that the variation in the numbers we're talking about, some of these places are reading, and I should have brought the information down, of 1.4 and 1.5, similar to my numbers, and we're talking about communities where they only made 100 traffic stops, and 8 of them was an African American or a minority. And yeah, they got the same kind of rating I did versus my 3,555 stops. Okay? So you have to look at the numbers as well. Okay? And I think in regard to, when you look at my numbers in comparison to similar communities, I find that Urbana is right in the middle. Am I satisfied with the numbers? No, I'm not. But by the same token, I have some concerns with the benchmarks we use to arrive at these numbers. Okay? Now, having said that, I still support and believe that this is a good document in works because it points out to us the need for additional training, mandatory use of the in-car videos, and a constant review and revision, if need be, of our policies. But it's just like when I first entered into law enforcement almost 40 years ago, and we were just beginning to work out the kinks in the Uniform Crime Report. When that was new, we've got to work this and massage this, and develop a more valid instrument, because the benchmark for this, some assumptions that had to be made in order to make these numbers meaningful was you had to assume that a police officer knew the race of the driver of that vehicle prior to the stop. Sometimes that is true. Most of the time, if it is a local driver, we possibly may know just from running the registration on the tag prior to the stop. But nighttime, or if we're shooting radar, that's not accurate. And of the 3,500 traffic stops we made, 1,100 of them are radar. And Northwestern acknowledges that radar stops are less likely biased even in this study. Okay?
Brandon, and then Dennis.
Yeah, did you, because in radar situations there is less likelihood that the officer can really determine the race, do you have numbers broken down that way, maybe on an internal report of yours, so that we could compare what the ratio is in radar stops versus the ratio in all our stops?
Well, it's included in this. It's
Right.
just that the 3,555
Right.
traffic stops, 1,100 of those are traffic radar stops.
Right, yeah, I'm saying if we broke out those 1,100, do you have a sense of what the ratio might be for just those 1,100?
No, I don't.
Okay.
Dennis?
It might be actually of more use to understand the quality of police stops concerning the white versus the black community, and I'm not sure this is totally accurate, but to know the percentage of stops that are made in the population, broken down by race, in which no fault is actually found by the police officer after the stop is made and the car is released without either a citation or a warning or anything like that. Because one of the comments that Danielle Chenoweth made is that she knew people who were being stopped, and apparently for no reason, that these four gentlemen were traveling in Champaign and Urbana, and they were stopped 4 times in one day when there was actually no violation apparent or given or a citation made. And I'm thinking that all stops are recorded by the department, I'm assuming, but I wonder how many stops are made where no citation is issued. That would be basically what I would call a frivolous stop or a mistaken stop. And it might be one of the areas that the police department could look at to refine its skills, because the larger that proportion is, or that ratio is, the less, well, there's, I guess, more question of why they're being stopped.
Well, and that is one of the assumptions that this study, this traffic data also included, and that is that in any traffic stop where a written citation wasn't given, meaning a ticket, or a written warning, it would be counted as a false traffic stop.
A false.
False. And because of that, I changed my policy in my department, effective January 1 of 2004, in that we would no longer engage in verbal warnings. If we stop you for traffic, you were going to get a ticket or either get a written warning, but you would get a piece of paper, and I would have a record of it. So we no longer do verbal warnings.
So you're basically saying that now when you stop people, definitely they do get a piece of paper?
As of January 1, 2004.
Even though potentially there was no reason to stop them initially?
Well, I have to take the assumption that when the men and women on my department stop you, they have a valid reason. That's how I train them. We don't stop citizens to socialize with them.
I appreciate that, but but the problem is, of course, that in the community at large,
Oh, I understand.
they have a completely different view of what's happening, and it
Right.
often truly was, maybe a stop. I know I personally was stopped, not in this town, on many occasions. Why? Not because I did anything. I would pull out of my driveway, and within half a block or 2 blocks, I'd be stopped by the police. Why? Because actually they were like watching the person who lived behind me. And they were always assuming that either I would be somehow associating with that person or I would know something about it. They'd actually start asking me, was he home? This is like I considered totally, aggravating. Had nothing to do with
Right.
me personally.
Yes, but see, that's...
And I'm
what
thinking that these
classify-
things can happen.
Oh, absolutely, but I would classify that based on the information you just supplied or stated. That would be a probable cause, a reasonable suspicion. That's not I'm speaking strictly...
Because I lived in front of this guy?
Yeah.
Just because I happened to, my driveway was near the guy's driveway, you think that's probable cause?
No, I'm saying that's the circumstance.
That is
That's
a circumstance.
not
I didn't like
the-
that circumstance, and
Right,
there's a lot of
but
people in
this
this community
is
who seem to
not-
be suffering from similar circumstances.
Right, but this is not... These are traffic stops only, okay?
I was in my car when I was stopped.
Right. But some
Okay.
of our stops are...
So
not
I'm
for
wondering
traffic.
if there, I guess, so now there's really no such thing as a false stop, because now all of the stops are legal.
Just in my department. Now, some departments
department,
still, okay, but I didn't want that as part of, if that's how it was going to be interpreted. And know that, verbal warning is really very good public relation for the police department, for an officer to walk up and be able to verbally tell a citizen, here's the violation I stopped you for, but because of whatever circumstances, I'm not going to write you a citation or a warning, give you a verbal and let you go. People appreciate that. But because of how it was going to be counted, I stopped it. Because if that's going to be counted against my department as a false stop, then I'm not going to do it.
Danielle?
I have some questions. One question is, are you saying that you called it reasonable suspicion, Dennis's situation?
Well, as he illustrated, just
Okay.
in oversimplified, that didn't have anything to do with traffic. They were stopping him
Yeah.
because
Okay.
they suspected his
Are those-
affiliation or involvement.
Would that situation be counted in this report?
No.
Okay, so it's not, so reasonable suspicion is not.
No, if you're investigating drug dealing or something like that, unless you have a traffic violation, no, you would stop him for other reasons.
Okay, so I guess that might be a piece of this picture is, for example, stories I've heard are things like, I was stopped because I'm young African American male and I've got a souped up vehicle, and so people think I'm out for trouble. I've been stopped and asked for my insurance card. They want to know if I have my insurance card. I guess that would be considered reasonable suspicion, or would you?
Well, you just can't stop the person
And ask
for his insurance. You got to have some other kind of
Okay.
violation.
Well, I'm
I mean,
relating.
we would ask you for that, though.
Mhm. That particular story is something that was within the last 2 weeks.
Mhm.
Is somebody was stopped in Urbana, and they were told that they were being stopped to see if they had their insurance card. So you would say that was an unauthorized stop.
Yeah, they would have to have some other violation or suspicion.
Okay.
Okay.
And so I think that might be part of the thing that we're trying to get at is stops like that where people are being stopped and they feel it's capricious and maybe it isn't even showing up on this data, but that's a piece of it. Just in terms of questions, do we keep location statistics even if they're not represented here? Do we keep statistics in terms of neighborhood or beat?
No.
Okay. Do we audio or video record traffic stops?
We're supposed to.
Okay, you're supposed to. And we
Vote.
don't, or?
No, we're supposed to.
Oh, we do.
Yes.
Okay, so if we wanted to go back and review reasons why people were stopped, we could look at the audio. Your office, could look at the audio and video to see why, what had transpired between an
You
officer.
could, the video would show you what occurred while they were stopped.
Okay.
I'm not sure it would identify for you the violation.
Okay. Let's see. Is traffic stop data analyzed internally, officer by officer? Like when people stop, do you have it based on the officers, broken down by officer, so you could see if there was an officer who was making disproportionate number of stops, your office would have access to that data?
That's a part of this data.
Oh,
this
so it's
data
actually,
does collect that.
It's
Yes.
actually broken down by individual officers?
Yes.
And sent to IDOT that way?
Yes.
Okay. But it's not in the report that we have because this is a boiled down report, so this
Yes.
isn't the information that you sent to IDOT?
Yes, this is the information I sent to IDOT.
But it doesn't include things broken down
No,
by
it doesn't
officer?
include that, no.
Okay, but that information
That
is
is,
collected?
yes, it's collected, and that's sent to IDOT.
Okay, but it's not here?
No. Mm.
Okay, is it possible to get the full
Yes,
thing
absolutely.
that's sent,
I
that
can
was sent
get,
to
no,
IDOT?
I can give it to you, or you can get it yourself. It's public information. Now, you can go to IDOT on your computer and get it. It's all there. It's
Okay.
public information. But if
Okay.
you'd like, I can give it to you. I can provide it for you.
Okay, I think that would be useful.
Mhm.
Just a couple of other questions. I know if Champaign had this a while ago and they stopped this practice, I don't know in terms of in Urbana, do officers have quotas, goals, or rewards for the number of traffic stops or traffic citations that they have in a given day?
No.
Okay, there's no quotas, there's no reward system?
No.
Okay, and then, in Champaign, one of the things that came out of that report that I thought was really interesting was looking at deployment practices. So, the Chief R.T. Finney had suggested that they talk to community groups and look at the geographic size of communities and the number of officers in certain beats, and that they consider adjusting the number of officers so there's not, in some ways, responding to this issue of if there's more police in your neighborhood, you're going to get busted more often, potentially for minor traffic violations. And so in trying to address that, looking to see how can we address crime in a given neighborhood without necessarily having an ongoing presence where there's more police activity in that area. Is that something that, I guess I'm looking for action items. We can talk about these issues, we can look at the information. What do you suggest in terms of us moving forward in terms of action? Is there a way to look at the deployment of officers in a particular neighborhoods and see if we can curtail the number of officers in certain neighborhoods if there's not criminal activity happening at that time? I mean, is there a way to look at that, or having a conversation with the community to see if we can police differently in certain neighborhoods that feel like there's a lot of police activity, the kind of siege feeling?
Well, I'm in the community. I'm going to respond to your question, but first, let me make a statement. I'm in the communities, all of them. And I have yet to encounter citizens that feel like Urbana police officers' presence creates a siege mentality. I have not encountered that in no area of the city of Urbana. Now, to respond to your question, we, as most police department, we staff based on demand for service, calls for service, reported crime, and we shift that staffing level accordingly. And especially the last several years in Urbana, that is no longer static. When I first come here almost 11 years ago, it was primarily north of University, the highest demand for police service here, and west of Cunningham. That is not the case anymore. The demographics of Urbana has changed. We have a growing low-income population here. When Birch Village was demolished, a significant number of those residents ended up in Urbana. And as I've always said, traffic is probably the most equitable product of police work we engage in, because when we involve ourselves in traffic enforcement activities, we encounter all citizens, high-income citizens, low-income citizens, middle-income citizens. Whereas if you look at my crime data, that's almost overwhelmingly low-income people. And unfortunately, minorities and African Americans in particular are overwhelmingly overrepresented in that group. And that's, as far as crime, that's our population base. That's the citizens that we primarily service. Not all, but primarily the majority of the people that call for our service. As one of the council persons stated, high-income people don't call for us. They handle it themselves. Except in accidents, DUIs, and traffic enforcement, we get very few calls. The same, to a lesser extent, is correct for middle income. So, and as you grow that low-income base, you increase my workload, meaning the Urbana Police Department, and we're seeing that here, okay? And it's no longer north of University and west of Cunningham. It's dispersed. And our tax credit properties, which are scattered all over town. And we've had to redeploy our assets accordingly. But I still have not encountered any group or any organization in Urbana that come forward to me expressing a concern because of high visibility of police in their neighborhood. Now, the opposite has been the case. I've had many citizen groups requesting additional police presence. One particular area in particular has been very demanding of that, of increased police presence.
Charlie, I believe you had a comment or question?
Yeah, we don't have enough police officers to maintain a state of siege. I'm trying to figure out, you know, we had 3 people speak to the issue, and I think each of them brought some suggestions that are worth considering. How do we go about collecting data that give us a better understanding of what's going on? And that's my own professional training is, you know, what are the things that we need to do? The Northwest Studies